The giantess aims her spear at his throat, but he bows to her from the grass and speaks in a language she doesn't understand. Hello, your canopy is about to collapse. Take 2 steps to the left. The giantess frowns. She tilts her head, and Kim Hajin lies in the grass taller than he is and pieces the picture together bit by bit. First, the smell. Wet earth, grass, something sweet and thick like honey, only 1,000 times thicker. Then pain bites into his neck, the very same neck that in a past life was broken by scaffolding erected by subcontractors in violation of his blueprints. He remembers that moment to this day. He remembers how he shouted that the load on the joint was twice the limit. He remembers how the foreman waved him off. He remembers the clang of metal and his last thought, "I told you so." He was dead. Now he is alive. And the first thing he sees above him are 2 green eyes in a face the size of a car hood. A woman, 3.5 meters tall, a braid down to her waist, the tip of a spear right at his throat. An architect's mind kicks in before fear. He looks to the left. The trees stretch upward and fade into a green mist at a height impossible to gauge without instruments. 200 meters, maybe 300. The bark is cracked wide enough for a doorway. Roots jut out of the ground like mountain ridges. He looks to the right, a canopy, 4 poles for support, joints at a 50-degree angle, no diagonal braces. At the first crosswind, the whole structure will tip over. 3 months at most. He knows this as surely as his own name. And here he bows and speaks of the canopy. But instead of answering, she grabs him by the leg and yanks him into the air, head first, like a rabbit from a snare. She carries him through the grass. Hajin dangles head first and looks at a world that cannot be. Flowers the size of laundry tubs, beetles the size of a palm crawl up the stems. A dragonfly sweeps over him with a wingspan like an eagle's. A dewdrop on a leaf is heavy and round as a glass ball. And ahead, between the trunks of the giants, a settlement comes into view. Woven huts, rope bridges in the treetops, smoke from campfires. And women. Women everywhere. 3 and 4 meters tall, with spears, with bows, with children in their arms. Not a single man. Imagine that chill running down your spine. Blood rushes to his head as he hangs upside down, trying to understand one thing, where he has ended up, and why there isn't a single man here. He is thrown to the ground in the center of the settlement, in front of another woman. This one is older, much older, 5 meters tall, white hair down to the ground, a face without a single wrinkle, but eyes that make Hajin understand immediately. This woman isn't 50. This woman is centuries old. She sits on the roots of a tree with a circumference of 20 meters and looks down at him as one looks at something long awaited. The hunter pokes at the net, pokes at him, cackles, says something, and her voice rings with mockery. The others join in, 20 or 30 warriors. All are armed. All look at him as if he were a bug a cat has dragged in. And he stands before them, waist deep in the mud and scraps of grass, not understanding a word, but he understands structures, and he sees what they don't. The central pillar of the hut behind the old woman is tilting 4 degrees. The rafters were laid without accounting for the weight of the roof. The drainage is dug with a reverse slope, and the very first downpour will flood the dwelling from the inside. 30 paces away, a well gapes open, without walls or a lid. Children are running about nearby, little giants, 1.5 meters tall. One runs up to the very edge and peeks down. Hajin feels a chill inside. 1 step. 1 more step and she'll plunge headfirst into the abyss. But her mother calls out to her, and the girl runs away. That was a close call, for now. And up above, a rope bridge sags between the trees, and the left knot on the 3rd support is frayed halfway through. A woman walks across the bridge with a basket on her back. The rope holds, but Hajin sees how the fibers are fraying one by one under the load. His brain calculates it all on its own, how it breathes, how much the knot will hold, how much time is left before it snaps. Who will be the next to cross the bridge? The elder mother leans down and touches his head with a single finger the size of his forearm, gently, like a scientist examining an unknown specimen. Hajin doesn't flinch. He looks up at her and thinks. She didn't kill him right away. They carried him alive. They didn't tie him up, but laid him in a net. So he's interesting. So there's a chance. He raises his hand and pokes at the crooked pillar, tilts his palm 4 degrees, shows how everything is crumbling, then pokes at the well, shows how a child falls down. Then he pokes at the bridge and runs the edge of his palm across his throat. The warrior women fall silent. The one with the scar takes a step forward and raises her spear. She thinks he's threatening her. She thinks the stranger is showing how he'll kill their children. The elder mother raises her hand. A single movement. The warrior freezes. The old woman looks at Hajin for a long time. Then she turns her head toward the bridge, toward where he pointed, and something in her face changes. She stands up, slowly. 5 meters of white stature straighten above the settlement, and everyone around bows their heads. She walks toward the bridge. The ground trembles slightly beneath her steps. She stops at the first support. She looks up at the third one, where the knot is frayed, and at that very moment, the fibers give way. The rope snaps with a crack like the crack of a whip. The woman with the basket manages to jump back onto the platform. The basket flies 40 meters down and smashes to the ground right at the feet of the elder mother. Silence. Complete silence. Hajin stands in this silence, waist deep among the lowest-ranking warriors, and realizes what has just happened. He predicted it. A minute ago, in a language no one here knows. The elder mother turns and looks at him, and now there is no mockery in her eyes. There is something else. Something he will only recognize later when he learns their language. Recognition. She had been waiting for him. For 300 years she had waited for someone like him. She had read in ancient scrolls of a builder from another world who would come, small in stature, but with eyes that see the future of buildings. She had seen him in a dream long before he fell into the hunter's snare. She had seen this very face, these very hands poking at the crooked pole. He knows none of this. He knows one thing: the pole is tilted. The well will kill the child. The bridge broke exactly when he said it would. And if he wants to live to see tomorrow, these women must understand one simple thing. They need him. The elder mother utters a few words, slowly, distinctly. Hajin doesn't understand their meaning, but she understands the tone. That's not how you speak to pray. That's how you speak to someone you've decided to spare. She makes a gesture with her hand. The scarred warrior lowers her spear. She approaches, and instead of killing him, she throws a rope around his neck. Thick, coarse, like for livestock. She ties it to her belt. Hajin examines her up close. The scar runs from her ear to her chin like a white furrow. Her shoulders are like those of a dock worker 3 times his size. Her eyes are dark and angry. She looks at him as if she'd rather wring his neck right now and not bother with the rest. She tugs on the rope without any expression. Hajin follows behind, on a leash, like a dog. They lead him through the entire settlement, and he looks around and counts. He counts without stopping. Here's a hut with a rotten bottom beam. Here's a hearth built without a chimney, and all the smoke pours into the dwelling. Here's a pen for some kind of livestock with a crooked fence. Here is a shed for drying hides that will collapse at the first snow, if it ever snows here. This whole settlement is on its last legs. Everything is built by eye, without a single calculation, without a single blueprint. These women are strong. They are hunters and warriors. They take down beasts 3 times their size, but they are not builders, and that is his chance. That is all there is to it. They lead him to a small cage woven from twigs at the foot of a huge tree. They open it. They shove him inside. They lock it. The twigs are as thick as his arm, impossible to break through. Hajin sits on the earthen floor, pulling his knees up to his chest. He watches through the twigs as the scarred warrior walks away without looking back. Evening falls. Between the trunks, giants, bonfires are lit. The settlement goes about its business. Women return from the hunt, dragging the carcasses of animals he doesn't recognize. They prepare the food. They feed the children. Somewhere, someone is singing. A high, clear voice floats over the settlement, and Hajin catches himself listening. It's beautiful. A strange, terrifying world, yet the singing is beautiful. He sits in his cage, hungry and beaten, with rope marks on his neck, and thinks. Not about how to escape. There's nowhere to run. All around is forest, where the grass is taller than a man, and the predators are the size of a bus. He thinks about something else, about what he saw that day. The crooked pole, the well, a bridge that collapsed at his word. He thinks like an architect. Where to start, what to fix first, how to explain to them without words what he's capable of. How to make himself indispensable before they decide it's easier to feed him to the beasts. A shadow approaches the cage. a small one. Hajin looks up. A girl. The very same one who peered into the well. About 5 feet tall, which, by their standards, makes her a tiny thing. She crouches by the bars and looks at him with huge, curious eyes. Without fear, without malice. She just looks the way a child looks at an unfamiliar little creature. Hajin looks back. She reaches her hand through the bars and places a piece of meat in front of him. Roasted, still warm. Then she says something quietly, almost in a whisper, and points first at herself, then at him. He doesn't understand the words, but he understands the gesture. She introduces herself. Hajin places her hand on her chest. Kim Hajin, he says. Kim Hajin. The girl frowns intently. She moves her lips and pronounces the syllables, stumbling over them. Ki, ma, jin. Close enough. For the first time on this terrible day, Hajin feels something ease inside him. He takes the meat, eats, hot, fatty, delicious enough to bring tears to her eyes, and the girl sits nearby behind the bars and watches him eat, and there is nothing in her gaze but childish curiosity. Somewhere above, in the darkness among the branches, the elder mother stands at the edge of the platform and looks down at the tiny cage at the tree's roots, at the stranger who spoke to the future today. She unrolls an old scroll, ancient, the leather cracked with age. There is a drawing on it, a small human figure among giants, and the figure's hands reach upward, supporting something enormous, a city, a tower, something this world has never seen before. She has waited 300 years, and now he sits in a cage, eating meat from the hands of her great-granddaughter. Tomorrow it will all begin. But for now, Hajin finishes the last bite. She licks her fingers. She lies down on the earthen floor, curling up against the cold. And before she drifts off to sleep, her final thought comes, clear and calm as a blueprint. A pillar. I'll start with that. Tomorrow, I'll straighten the pillar, and they will see. The first day in the new world is over. The assignment has been accepted. 3 days on a rope. For 3 days, Hajin followed Sarah as if tethered, because he was tethered. She didn't speak to him, didn't look at him. She simply went where she needed to go, and he followed. If he slowed down, the rope tightened, and he stumbled. If he fell, she didn't stop. He was dragged along the ground until he got up on his own. He slept on the ground next to her bed. He ate whatever she threw at him. Roots, some green fruits the size of his head, meat roasted over coals, without salt or spices. He ate everything, silently, without complaint, because there was no one to complain to, and no language to do it in. In 3 days, he learned 14 words: water, food, stop, go, no, yes, tree, stone, rope, knife, fire, big, small, and the word everyone used to call him, Shorty. He figured that out from the way they pointed at him and laughed. Shorty, small, insignificant. The elves weren't mean. He was just a little animal to them, amusing, harmless, incomprehensible. The children came up and touched his hair, black, straight, unlike their light and red manes. A girl about his height tugged his ear and ran away with a squeal. He wasn't offended. He was counting. On the 3rd day, a trade caravan from a neighboring tribe passed through the village. 12 giant women carried bundles on their backs containing something resembling dried mushrooms the size of a chair. Their path led across a ravine, 16 meters deep, a rope. Hajin stopped and looked at the bridge. Sarah tugged on the rope. He didn't move. She turned around. He pointed at the bridge. She frowned. He looked at the knots, at the slack and the supporting ropes, at how the bridge swayed when the first 2 giantesses stepped onto it. The left rope on the 3rd support, the very one he had noticed on the first day. The knot was coming undone. The fibers were as thin as a spider web. The load from 2 giantesses, each 4 meters tall. That's about a ton of live weight on a support that could hold a maximum of 600 kilograms. He glanced quickly at Sarah. She didn't understand. He pointed at the bridge. Then he folded his hands. Then he spread them wide apart and said the only word he knew in their language with the right meaning. No. Sarah raised an eyebrow. He repeated it. No. He pointed at the 3rd support, then at the knot, then spread his arms again. It's falling. Everything's falling. Sarah looked at the bridge, then at him. She snorted, but she translated. She shouted something to the caravan women, more with mockery than with alarm. Something about the little captive saying the bridge will fall. A caravan woman on the bridge laughed and shouted something back. Hajin didn't understand the words, but got the tone. What could a shorty know about bridges? He clenched his teeth. Then he slowly walked to the edge of the ravine as far as the rope would allow. He knelt down. He stretched out his hand and pointed to the third knot. Then he picked up a pebble from under his feet, a small one, about the size of a fist. He placed it in his palm. With his other hand, he pointed at the knot. Then he crushed the pebble between his fingers. Sarah stopped smiling. She stepped closer to the edge. She looked at the knot. Hajin saw how her face changed. She saw it, the frayed fibers, the gap in the rope. She screamed, loudly, in a commanding voice that made Hajin's ears ring. The caravan women stopped, froze on the bridge. Then, one by one, they began to cross to the other side. With every step, the bridge swayed more violently. Hajin counted in his head. The load on the third knot, the vibration with every step, the amplitude of the sway, the strength reserve of the remaining fibers. Maybe 10 minutes, maybe 5. The last caravan woman stepped onto the bank. Hajin exhaled. Then he looked at Sarah and said one word in their language. Stone. Then he pointed to the middle of the bridge. Sarah understood. She picked up a boulder the size of... She hurled it toward the middle of the bridge. The stone struck the deck. The bridge shuddered. The third knot snapped with a dry crack like a bone. The left rope sagged. Planks rained down into the 16-meter chasm. 3 seconds later, the entire bridge collapsed and fell into the ravine. Silence. Absolute silence. 12 caravan women stood on the opposite bank and stared into the void where the bridge they had been crossing had just been. The warriors at the edge of the ravine were silent. The children behind their mothers' backs were silent. Sarah was silent. Then, footsteps were heard coming from the direction of the sacred tree. Heavy, steady. The elder mother Loranal was walking through the settlement. The crowd parted before her. 5 meters tall, white hair, an expressionless face. She approached the edge of the ravine. She looked down at the bridge's wreckage. Then she turned to Hajin. She slowly crouched down to be at his eye level. Her face was right in front of his. Green eyes, ancient, like the forest itself. She began to speak, slowly, in another language, not the one the elves used among themselves, in a broken, rough dialect with short words, the language of trade. Hajin didn't know that one either, but the words were simpler, and she repeated them, patiently. Little man, what do you see else? He understood. Not everything, but the main thing. She was asking what else he saw. Hajin slowly raised his hand and pointed to the central post of the nearest hut, then to the well, then to the rafters of the shed, then to the drainage ditch, then to the chimney, then to the hitching post, then to everything around him. Loranal looked at him for a long time. Then she stood up. She said something to Sarah, short, like an order. Sarah nodded. She walked over to Hajin and removed the rope from his neck. His wrists remained bound for another day, but the rope around his neck was gone. He was no longer an animal. He had become something else. He didn't yet know exactly what, but Loranal knew. She watched as Hajin rubbed his neck where the rope had been, and in her ancient eyes was something none of those standing nearby could see. Hope. Freedom smelled just like captivity, like wet grass and smoke, but without the rope around his neck, the world had grown wider. Hajin could now walk through the village, not alone. Sarah followed him 3 paces behind, not like a guard, like a shadow, silent, attentive, with a sword at her belt. The shackles were removed from his wrists the morning after the incident at the bridge. Loranal came personally and cut them off with a knife. Hajin bowed. She nodded, and left, without a word. He began to learn the language. 30 new words every day. He pointed at an object. Sarah named it. He repeated it. She corrected him. He repeated it again. By the end of the first week, he could form simple sentences. Water flows down. A tree breaks here. A stone does not break. A wall stands straight. That was enough. He walked around the village and looked. He counted. He memorized. The village was called Liraswet, and about 6,000 elves lived there. The huts stood in circles around the sacred tree. Each circle represented one clan, 7 clans, 7 circles. In the center stood a giant tree with a circumference of 25 meters and roots as thick as 3 human figures. There were no roads between the huts, just trampled earth. When it rained, everything turned into a mess up to a giantess's knees and up to Hajin's chest. 3 wells for 6,000 inhabitants, all 3 without walls, just holes in the ground. Children played near them. He saw a little girl of about 4 run up to the edge and peer down. His heart stopped for a second. Then her mother grabbed the child by the hand and pulled her back. Business as usual. They were used to it. He couldn't get used to it. He started small. On the 8th day he found clay. A stream 100 steps from the village was washing away the bank, and yellow, malleable clay was visible in the cut. Hajin scooped it up with his hands. He brought it to the nearest well. Sarah watched. He molded a small model out of the clay. A well with walls, a lid on top, a gate with a rope and a bucket. He placed the model on the ground in front of Sarah. He pointed. Water here, wall here. The child doesn't fall. Sarah looked at the model. She looked at the well. She looked at Hajin. She shrugged and said one word. Why? He didn't know how to say it in their language. Because children die. That was all he knew. Little one. Falls. Down. No. He said that. Sarah frowned. Then she left and returned with 2 young female warriors. Hajin showed them what to do. With his hands. Sticks. Clay. They dug and carried stones. He showed them where to place them. How to level them. How to check the vertical with the simplest plumb line made of a stone on a rope. By evening, one well had stone walls as high as a giantess's waist, rough, uneven, but walls. The next day he made a cover out of poles and twigs, then a second well, then a third. Liranil came to look on the 3rd day. She touched the wall. She tapped on the cover. She looked at Hajin and said in the trade dialect, no children had fallen into the wells for 300 years. Hajin replied slowly, choosing his words carefully. Children had fallen. She was silent for a long time. Then she nodded and left. A week later, not a single child could approach the water without a cover. It went unnoticed. It was an everyday occurrence. No one celebrated, but the mothers remembered, and Hajin was already thinking of something else. The water wheel. Every day he saw the same scene. 4 giantesses stood by a huge stone mortar and pounded grain with wooden pestles. All day long. From morning till night, hands covered in calluses, backs bent, monotonous work that consumed 4 pairs of working hands every day. Hajin looked at the stream. The drop from the highest point to the lowest was about 3 meters over a length of 50 meters. Enough. He began to draw, not on paper. There was no paper here. On flat pieces of bark, with a piece of charcoal from the fire. A lower run water wheel, the simplest design. A wheel with blades on an axle. The current pushes against the blades from below. The wheel turns. The axle transmits the rotation to the millstone. The millstone grinds the grain. 4 women are free. He drew for 3 days. He redrew it. He calculated in his head without a calculator. The wheel's diameter, the width of the blade, the depth of immersion, the gear ratio, the weight of the millstone, the speed of the current. Everything sketched out. Everything in pencil. On the 4th day, he came to Seta with a finished drawing. He showed it to her. Water turns it. Stone grinds. Women don't have to pound. Seta looked at the drawing for a long time. Then she asked, "Is this magic?" He shook his head. "No, water, stone, wood." She didn't believe him, but she took him to Liranil. The elder mother looked at the drawing even longer. She asked questions in the trade dialect. Hajin answered as best he could. He showed half the words with his hands. Liranil turned to Seta and gave an order. "Give him 10 workers and materials. If it doesn't work in a month, it doesn't work. He'll have to hang himself again." Hajin bowed. He had a month. Hajin began learning the Elvish language and surveyed the village of Lidaswet, discovering many dangerous flaws in the structures. He built stone walls and covers for 3 wells, protecting the children from falling in. Liranil gave him a month and 10 female workers to build a water wheel that would replace manual labor at the mill. Building without knowing the language is like performing surgery while wearing felt gloves. It's possible, but every movement requires 3 times the effort. The 10 female workers Liranil had provided looked up at Hajin, that is, from top to bottom. To them, he was knee-high. The eldest of the 10 giants was named Merva, 4 meters tall, broad palms, short, light hair, the face of a person who had seen a lot of foolishness, and from them. She listened to Sarah's order and looked at Hajin with an expression that needed no translation. I must listen to this creature. Hajin didn't waste time on words. He took a piece of bark with a drawing on it. He laid it on the ground. He stood on a rock to be a little taller, and he began to demonstrate. A stick. This is the axle. It spins like this. A paddle. This is how the water pushes. A stone. This is how it grinds. Merva watched. So did the other 9. No one understood. Hajin took a deep breath. Then he took 3 sticks and a rope. He tied together a small wheel, crooked, skewed, but similar. He placed it in the stream. The current hit the paddle sticks. The little wheel turned, slowly, unsteadily, but it turned. Merva leaned forward. She looked. She straightened up. She looked at Hajin. For the first time, without contempt, with interest, the work began. The first problem was the axle. He needed a straight log 4 meters long and 30 centimeters in diameter, smooth, not free. In a forest full of giant trees, finding such a log turned out to be unexpectedly difficult. All the trees were too thick, the branches too crooked. Hajin spent a day searching. He found a young tree of the right size a kilometer from the village. He showed it to Merva. She pulled out an axe. One swing, the tree fell. The giantess's strength was incredible. What would have taken a crew of workers in Seoul an hour with a chainsaw took 3 minutes here, if you knew where to cut. The problem wasn't strength. The problem was precision. Hajin drew lines on the log. Trim here, leave it here. Merva chopped. Roughly. Splinters flew. Hajin stopped her. He showed her the plumb line. He showed her how to check for levelness. She was angry. She wasn't used to anyone telling her how to hold an axe, especially a creature she could step on the head of without even bending down. But she did it, because it was the elder mother's order. On the 5th day, they set the axle on 2 stone supports. Hajin checked the level. A deviation of 2 fingers, good enough for a first try. The spokes were carved from flat planks. The planks were split from tree trunks with wedges. Hajin showed them how to drive in a wedge so the plank would be level. 8 spokes around the circumference of the wheel. Each was secured to the rim with ropes and wooden pegs. The wheel turned out a bit crooked, 3 meters in diameter, heavy. 8 giantesses lifted it and placed it on the axle. Hajin stood nearby and spoke. To the left, further to the left. Stop. They listened. Not because they respected him, because he was the only one who knew where everything was supposed to go. The millstone was the next problem. They needed 2 flat stones, one stationary, one rotating. Hajin found suitable boulders by the river, granite, flat, but they needed to be shaped. He showed them how, stone against stone, patiently, for hours. Merva carved the lower millstone for 2 days. She cursed in a language that Hajin was already beginning to understand. He picked out individual words. Heavy, stupid, why? That little man is crazy. Another worker made the upper millstone. She was shorter, thinner, quieter. Her name was Elia. She didn't curse, she just worked. And sometimes she glanced at the sketch on the bark with curiosity. On the 20th day, everything was ready. The wheel on the axle on the supports, the blades in the water, the millstones in place, the transmission mechanism made of wood and ropes, rough, primitive, but functional. Hajin checked everything 3 times. He called for Sarah. She came. She stood. She crossed her arms over her chest. He asked Merva to open the damper that directed the flow of water onto the blades. Merva lifted the wooden shield. Water gushed onto the blades. The wheel wobbled. It creaked. It didn't move. Hajin held his breath. The water pressed down. The blades resisted. Something was jamming the axle. He ran to the support and saw it. A splinter. A small splinter was stuck between the axle and the support. He pulled it out with his fingers. The wheel creaked again and began to turn, slowly, with a groan, but it was turning. The axle transmitted the rotation to the millstone. The upper stone began to grind against the lower one. Merva stood with her mouth open. Elia stepped closer. Hajin shouted, "Grain! Pour in the grain!" One of the workers snapped out of her daze and poured a basket of grain into the opening of the upper millstone. The stone ground. Flour poured out, white, fine. Without 4 pairs of hands, without wooden pestles, without bent backs, water did the work. Sarah walked up to the mill. She touched the flour with her finger. She tasted it on her tongue. She looked at the wheel spinning on its own. Then she looked at Hajin. He stood there, covered in mud, in sawdust, with scraped fingers, up to her knees, and he was smiling. Sarah didn't smile back. But something had changed in her eyes, a small shift, imperceptible to everyone except the one who was watching. Hajin was watching. By evening, a crowd had gathered at the mill. 4 women who had spent their whole lives pounding grain by hand stood and watched as the stone turned on its own. One of them, named Talve, who was over 50 and whose fingers no longer straightened fully due to arthritis, began to cry, quietly, silently, just tears running down her cheeks. Hajin saw this and turned away because his own throat had tightened. They learned his name that evening, not Shorty, Kim Hajin, the man who made the water work. In 20 days, Hajin built the world's first water wheel with a mill, overcoming the language barrier and the workers' distrust. The wheel started working and freed the 4 women from the daily task of grinding grain by hand. For the first time, they began to call him by his name instead of Shorty. After the mill, Hajin's world changed. Not immediately, not dramatically, but irreversibly. They no longer made him wear the rope. He was given his own hut, a small one. By elven standards, it was a storage room. By his standards, a normal room, a bed of dry grass, a roof of woven twigs, walls of bark. The first thing he did was check the angle of the rafters. Insufficient. It would leak when it rained. He rebuilt the roof in half a day. Sarah watched. He already understood a third of what was being said around him. The language was difficult for him. Elvish grammar was fluid. Words changed meaning depending on intonation and the length of vowels. But the trade dialect was simpler, rougher, more straightforward. In it, he could already explain what he needed, and in it, he began talking to Sarah in the evenings. Not long conversations, short questions, short answers. What kind of tree is that? An ironwood tree. It's hard, very hard. What kind of beast is that in the distance? A stag, dangerous. Don't go to the river at night. Why are there no men in the village? Sarah fell silent after that question, for a long time. Then she said a single word he didn't know. He asked her to explain. She said, "Men are not born, not for a long time." He didn't press her for details, but he remembered. By the end of the first month, he knew the village better than any of its female inhabitants. He had walked every corner, counted every hut. He measured distances with his steps. He drew a map of the settlement on a large piece of bark, from above, like an architectural blueprint. 7 circles of huts around the sacred tree, 3 wells, 1 stream, 2 ravines, trails to the hunting grounds, trails to the fields, a trail to the river. He saw problems they didn't see because they were used to them. Drainage. The entire village stood in a low-lying area. Every time it rained, water pooled between the huts. Mud, dampness, rot, disease, infant mortality. He sketched out a system of ditches that would carry water away from the living quarters to the stream. A 2-degree slope, that would be enough. Water supply. He reinforced the wells, but the water in them was stagnant. It became polluted. Higher up the slope, 400 meters from the village, a spring gushed forth, clean, cold. If a pipe were run from it to the village, the water would flow on its own, by gravity. He knew how. Bamboo. Something very similar to bamboo grew in the forest. Thick, hollow stems. If they were joined together, the joints sealed with resin, laid with a slope, clean water in every one of the village. He came to Liranil with this plan. He spread out the bark with the drawings in front of her. He spoke in the trade dialect, slowly and clearly. The water from above is clean. The water in the wells is dirty. Dirty water kills children. Liranil listened. Standing nearby was a young woman whom Hajin had never seen this close before. Tall, over 4 meters, light hair, cold gray eyes, a spear on her back, the bearing of someone accustomed to giving orders. Princess Ariel, the heiress. She looked at Hajin with an expression he had already learned to recognize. Contempt. Not malicious, more like disdainful. The way one looks at an ant that has crawled onto the dining table. Ariel said something to her mother, quickly, in High Elvish. Hajin didn't catch everything, but he caught the gist. Why listen to a man, especially a stranger, especially a short one? Liranil replied to her daughter calmly. Hajin couldn't make out the words, but Ariel clenched her teeth and fell silent. Liranil turned to Hajin and nodded. Get to work. He started the next morning. This time they gave him 20 workers, and Merva as forewoman. Merva came with an axe slung over her shoulder and said, "The little man's madness again." But she said it without malice, almost warmly. They chopped bamboo, hollow stalks as thick as a giantess's arm. Hajin hadn't yet explaining how to clean out the partitions inside, how to fit the stalks together, how to seal the joints with resin, how to check the slope, 2 degrees. He carved the simplest level out of wood, 2 blocks with a stone tied to a string. When the string lines up with the mark, the slope is correct. Merva looked at the tool. She turned it over in her hands. She held it up to the ground. She checked it. She raised her eyebrows. A simple device, but no one here had made one before, because no one here had thought about slopes. Water just flowed wherever it wanted. They dragged the pipe for 10 days, 400 meters from the spring to the village, through the undergrowth, over the roots of giant trees. Sometimes they had to go around obstacles. Sometimes we had to lift the pipe onto wooden supports. Hajin ran along the route like an ant along a branch. He checked every joint, every slope, every connection. On the 8th day, the pipe was laid to the first circle of huts. Hajin installed the simplest wooden tap, a stopper on a string. He pulled it. Water flowed, clean, cold, straight from a mountain spring. It gushed from the pipe in a thin, steady stream and fell into a stone trough he had laid out in advance. The women stood around, silent. One held out her palm, cupped some water, tasted it, clean, no aftertaste, no cloudiness, not from a hole in the ground, not with worms and silt, clean water. Hajin stood nearby and watched their faces, how their expressions changed. Surprise, disbelief, and then something gentle, quiet, gratitude they couldn't put into words, because no one had ever done anything like this for them. In the evening, a priestess came to him. He had seen her before from a distance, young, 5 feet 9, honey-colored hair, large eyes, white robes of fine fabric. Luni Aive, the tree's junior priestess. She came to his hut, sat on the ground in front of the entrance. He came out. She looked down at him even while sitting. She spoke in the trade dialect. Slowly, carefully, she asked, "Water flows down sticks. Why?" He sat down across from her. He thought about how to explain it. He said, "Water flows down, always down. If the stick is tilted, the water flows along the stick. It's not magic, it's a slope." Luni frowned. She asked, "What is a slope?" He took a stick, placed it flat on the ground. The water stands still. He tilted the stick. The water flows. The angle of the tilt is the slope. 2 fingers for 100 steps. That's enough. Luni looked at the stick, at him, at the stick. Then she stood up. She said, "I'll be back tomorrow with questions." And she left. Hajin watched her go. The first person in this world who asked not what he was doing, but why it worked. He lay down on a bed of dry grass in his little hut and, for the first time in a month, thought not of structures, but of people. Of Talva, whose fingers won't straighten. About Merva, who curses but gets things done. About Sarah, who is silent but doesn't leave. About Luni, who wants to understand. About Liranil, who looks at him as if he were the answer to a question she'd been asking for 300 years. And about Princess Ariel, who looks at him as if he were an insect. She'll be the hardest to deal with, but that's for later. Right now, he has a mill, wells, a water supply. 3 things you can't miss. 3 proofs that he's more useful alive than dead. Sarah said one sentence to him tonight, the first sentence that wasn't an order or an answer to a question. She said, "Shorty, you're strange, but useful." He took it as a compliment, because a week ago she wouldn't have said even that. He closed his eyes. Tomorrow he'll start the drainage ditches, then the septic tank, then a new bridge across the ravine, a stone one that won't collapse, one that will stand for 100 years, but that's tomorrow. Right now he was just lying in the dark, listening to the sounds of a foreign world. The wind in the treetops of 300-meter-tall trees, the distant howl of an unknown beast, the quiet laughter of elven girls by the campfire, and the murmur of water in a bamboo pipe that, for the first time in the history of this world, carried clean water where a man wanted it to go, and not where the river wanted. During his first month, Hajin built a water supply system out of bamboo pipes, bringing clean water from a mountain spring to the village. He met Princess Ariel, who treated him with contempt, and the priestess Luni, who was the first to show intellectual interest in his methods. 3 projects were completed, and Hajin proved his worth to the tribe. Luni returned the following evening, and the next, and the next. Each time she brought with her a piece of bark and a stick charred at one end. She drew, she wrote, She asked questions that sometimes made Hajin pause and think, because the answers required words he didn't yet know in the trade tongue. Why stone is heavier than wood. Why water doesn't flow upward. Why a round wheel turns but a square one doesn't. He explained, with sticks, with clay, with pebbles, sometimes with drawings. Looney picked it up quickly, faster than he expected. On the third evening, she drew a diagram of the water system herself from memory, correctly, with the slope, with the joints marked. Hajin looked at her drawing and felt something he hadn't felt since his university days, a teacher's joy. But there was no time for lessons during the day. The drainage couldn't wait. The rainy season was approaching. The locals determined this by the color of the leaves on the sacred tree. When the leaves darken at the edges, there's only a month left until the rains. The leaves had already begun to darken. Hajin laid out the system of ditches, 23 ditches, a giantess's elbow wide, 2 elbows deep, sloping from the village center toward the stream. Each ditch was lined with stone at the bottom to prevent erosion. 20 women were digging. Merva was in charge. Hajin ran from ditch to ditch with a level, checking the slope, muddy, wet, up to their ears in clay. Ariel walked by on the third day of work. She stopped. She looked at Hajin, who was standing waist deep in the ditch, measuring the depth with a notched stick. She said something to her companion. The woman laughed. Hajin didn't turn around. He didn't show that he'd heard. He kept working. Sarah stood nearby and looked at Ariel, then at Hajin. She said nothing. The drainage was finished in 12 days, just in time. The first downpour hit at night. Hajin wasn't sleeping. He lay in the hut and listened to the water pounding on the roof. Then he got up and went outside. The rain was coming down in sheets. He got soaked instantly. He ran to the nearest ditch. The water flowed over the stone, evenly, quickly, toward the stream, past the huts, past the yards. The ground between the houses was wet, but not flooded. Before, there used to be knee-deep mud here after a downpour. Now the water drained away in minutes. He checked all 23 ditches. They were working, all of them. He returned to the hut, wet and frozen. Sarah was standing at the entrance, wet too. She held something out to him, a piece of thick fabric, large. It could be used as a blanket, she said. Don't get wet. You'll get sick. It'll be a hassle dealing with you later. He took the cloth. She left. It was the first gift in his new life. 3 days after the downpour, Lirinal summoned him. Hajin came. He bowed. The elder mother sat in her hut by the sacred tree. 4 other women sat nearby, elderly, important, the council of mothers. They looked at him with curiosity that poorly concealed their wariness. Lirinal spoke, slowly, in the trade dialect for him. Little man, the water in the village is clean. The earth in the village is dry. The flour grinds itself. You did this in a single moon. Hajin nodded. Lirinal continued. The crimson horde is coming from the east, ogres with iron. They have already burned 3 villages of distant tribes. Our walls are made of wood. Their battering rams break wood. Hajin was silent. He listened. In a year, maybe sooner, they will come here. Lirinal looked straight at him. You can build a wall that a battering ram won't break. It wasn't a question. It was a statement with a pause at the end. Hajin thought. A wall. A stone wall. Not a palisade of logs. A wall with a foundation. With mortar. With buttresses. There's no cement here, but there is limestone. He had seen white stones by the river. If you burn the limestone, you get quicklime. Mix it with sand and water, you get mortar. Not as strong as Portland cement, but it'll be enough for the first stone wall in the history of this world. He looked at Lirinal. He said, yes, I can, but I need more people, more time, and stone. Lots of stone. Lirinal nodded. She turned to the council of mothers. They began talking among themselves, quickly, in High Elvish. Hajin understood individual words: stone, wall, war, man, stranger. One of the elder mothers raised her voice. Hajin caught the gist. Entrusting the tribe's walls to a man, a stranger, a short man, a disgrace. Another objected. The mill, water, ditches, it works. A third remained silent. A fourth shook her head. Lirinal raised her hand. Everyone fell silent. She said one word. It's decided. Then she turned to Hajin. 50 workers. Sarah stays with you. Build. He stepped out of the hut and looked up at the sky through the canopy of giant trees. 50 workers. A stone wall. Against an army of ogres with iron battering rams. He was a bridge engineer. He had built bridges and residential complexes. He had never built a fortress, but he knew physics. He knew structural mechanics. He knew what shear stress and overturning moment were. A wall is simply a structure, and a structure is forces and materials. He would manage. He had to manage. Looney began studying regularly with Hajin and showed a knack for engineering. The drainage system withstood the first downpour and proved its effectiveness. Lirino reported the approach of the Crimson Horde and commissioned Hajin to build a stone fortress wall, assigning him 50 female workers. They found limestone on the 5th day of their search, white outcrops of rock on a river cliff 2 kilometers from the village. Hajin stood before the cliff and looked at the 10-meter-high stone wall. Pure limestone, light in color, softer than granite, easier to work with, perfect. Sarah stood nearby, waiting. He turned to her and said, "We need a kiln, a big one." He drew a diagram on the ground, a pit as deep as a giantess is tall, the walls lined with stone. On top, a clay dome with a hole for smoke. Limestone and firewood are placed inside. The fire burns for 2 days. The limestone turns into white powder. Quicklime. Mix it with water. You get a mortar. The mortar binds the stones. The stones hold up the wall. The wall withstands the impact. Sarah listened. She nodded. She gave the order. 10 workers began digging a pit for the kiln. The remaining 40 hauled stone. Hajin divided the construction into stages. The first stage was the foundation, a trench around the perimeter of the village, not the entire perimeter. He understood that it was impossible to surround 6,000 residents with a stone wall in a few months. He chose a different strategy. The wall would enclose the village on the eastern side. That's where the horde would come from. On the other 3 sides there were forests and ravines, natural defenses. The eastern wall, 400 meters long, 3 meters high, 1 meter thick at the base, 2 towers at the corners, a gate in the center. That would be enough for the first year. Then they could expand. He sketched the plan every evening by the light of the campfire. Looney sat beside him and traced it. She already understood what his symbols meant, the lines of the walls, the circles for the towers, the arrows indicating the direction of attack. Once she asked, "What if they don't come from the east?" Hajin looked at her, smiled. "Good question." He pointed on the map. "The forest is too dense to the north. The battering rams won't get through. To the south is a ravine. To the west, a river. The only route for an army with heavy equipment is the eastern clearing." Looney nodded. She wrote it down. It took 4 attempts to fire the limestone. The first kiln collapsed. The clay walls couldn't withstand the heat. Hajin rebuilt it. He added stone ribs inside. The second kiln held up, but the temperature was insufficient. The limestone didn't turn into lime. Hajin increased the airflow. He dug a channel to the lower opening for draft. Third attempt. Better, but the firing was uneven. The central stones turned to lime. The ones on the edges remained raw. He changed the arrangement. Small pieces on the edges, large ones in the center. Fourth attempt. After 2 days of burning, Merva scooped a white, glowing powder out of the kiln. Hajin took a pinch. He dropped it into a bucket of water. The powder hissed. The water bubbled. Merva recoiled. Hajin said, "Don't touch it with your hands. You'll get burned." Then he added sand. He stirred it with a stick. A thick, gray mass formed. A mortar. He took 2 stones. He placed the mortar between them. He pressed them together. He waited. An hour later, he tried to pull them apart. The stones held. Merva tugged. They wouldn't budge. She tugged harder. The giantess, with hands capable of bending young trees, pulled at the 2 stones held together by the gray paste and couldn't separate them. She looked at Hajin. Her expression changed. It wasn't just interest, it was respect. The first genuine respect from a worker who, a month ago, had considered him a useless insect. They dug the foundation for 3 weeks, a trench 1.5 meters wide and 1 meter deep, 400 meters. The soil here was soft. Tree roots got in the way. They had to be chopped off. Hajin got nervous every time the giantess's axe plunged into the root of a colossal tree. He didn't know which roots were nourishing and which weren't. He didn't know if cutting them would kill the tree. Looney helped. She could sense the trees. The priestesses of the tree knew how to do this. She would place her hand on a root and speak. "This one is alive. Don't cut it. This one is dry. It's okay." Hajin nodded. A strange symbiosis. An engineer and a priestess. Blueprints and magic. It worked. They cut stone for the wall and the cliff face. Rough blocks. Uneven. He would have preferred smooth ones, but there were no tools. There were axes and wedges. The giantesses chopped the stone like firewood. Rough but effective. Hajin showed them how to drive wedges along the line, how to chip off flat slabs, how to fit the blocks together. Mortar would fill the gaps. The wall would stand. The first rows of masonry were up by the end of the 2nd month, 1/2 meter above the foundation. 400 meters of gray stone held together by lime mortar, not very high, but it was stone. The first stone-laden mortar in the history of this world. One evening, as Hajin sat by the fire drawing up plans for the tower, Ariel approached him, not with her retinue, alone. He saw her shadow before he heard her footsteps. 4 meters and 20 centimeters of shadow in the moonlight. She stopped beside him. She was silent. Then she sat down, not crouching to be at his level, as Loranel used to do. She simply sat down with her legs crossed. She was still twice as tall. Hajin continued to draw. He waited. Ariel spoke in the trade dialect, awkwardly. She was clearly not used to speaking this language. 3 villages have been burned. The horde is closer. My scouts saw smoke 5 days' journey away. Hajin looked up. 5 days' journey. That could be 100 kilometers, maybe 200. He didn't know how fast ogres moved, but he knew that a half-meter-high wall wouldn't stop anyone. Ariel was staring at the wall. Her voice was steady, but her fingers gripped the spear shaft so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She said, "You'll make it." It wasn't a question either. He looked into her eyes, gray, hard, frightened. She was afraid. An heiress who had no right to be afraid. He said, "I'll make it." She stood up. She left. She didn't look back. Hajin looked at the tower's blueprint, then at the half-meter wall in the darkness, then back at the blueprint. 5 days' journey. We need to go faster. Hajin perfected the burning of limestone and obtained mortar, which was a breakthrough in construction technology. Work began on the eastern fortress wall, 400 meters long with 2 towers. Ariel came to him in person for the first time and reported that scouts had spotted smoke from the Crimson Horde 5 days' journey away. The pace of construction doubled when Hajin invented block hoists, a simple lifting mechanism, a rope thrown over a wooden block on a tripod. One person on the ground pulls the rope, the stone rises upward. Without this, the giantesses had to haul the blocks onto the wall by hand. Even with their strength, it was slow and dangerous. With the pulleys, a single 200-kilogram stone block could be lifted in a minute. Merva looked at the mechanism and said, "Why didn't we know this before?" Hajin didn't answer, because the answer was too long and too sad. They didn't know because there was no one to teach them. Because the men who, in the human world, had spent centuries inventing levers and pulleys were dying in their cradles here. Because the women of this world were stronger than any man and never needed mechanisms to strengthen their weak arms, until they encountered an enemy who possessed iron. The wall grew. A meter and a half, 2 meters. Hajin slept for 4 hours. The rest of the time he spent on the construction site. He lost weight. His skin was sunburned, then burned again. His hands were scraped raw by the stone. Sarah silently brought him food when he forgot. She set it down nearby and left. Sometimes he found fresh cloth by his bed to bandage his hands. He didn't ask who it was from. At the end of the 3rd month, when the wall reached 2.5 meters, refugees arrived in the village. 38 women and 11 children from the village of Taliros. Exhausted, dirty. Some were wounded. The horde had burned their village a week ago. They had walked through the forest without food or water. 3 children hadn't made it. Hajin stood by the wall and watched as they were led through the village. Little giants as tall as he was. Dirty faces, empty eyes. One girl was limping. Another carried her youngest sister in her arms. She wasn't moving. He didn't know if she was alive in those arms or not. He clenched his fists, grit his teeth, turned toward the wall and said to Merva, "One more row before dark." Merva looked at the refugees, looked at Hajin, nodded. They worked until dark and another hour by torchlight. That evening, Ariel was in charge of settling the refugees. Hajin saw her from a distance. She was carrying a wounded child in her arms, carefully, like a glass vase. Her face was stony, only her hands were trembling. He turned away, picked up his trowel, continued applying the mortar. That night Looney came to him, not with questions. She just sat down next to him. She was silent. Then she spoke. The girl in her sister's arms. She had been dead for 2 days already. Her sister carried her and wouldn't let go. Hajin closed his eyes. Looney continued. "The elder priestesses say this is the forest's punishment. They say we have angered the spirits. They say the stranger's stone walls insult the tree." Hajin opened his eyes. He looked at Looney. Her face was calm, but her fingers were twisting the hem of her clothes. She was afraid, not of the ogres, of her own people, the priestesses who might declare his construction a sacrilege. He asked, "Do you think so too?" Looney shook her head. "No, I think the ogres killed that girl, not the stone." A pause. Then she added, "But I'm the youngest. No one listens to me." Hajin nodded. He stood up. He walked toward Liranil's hut. Sarah followed him. He asked for an audience. Liranil was awake. She sat in the darkness with her eyes open. He entered. He bowed. He spoke in the trade dialect, which he now spoke almost fluently. "Elder Mother, the priestesses say the wall angers the forest. If you order the construction to stop, there will be no wall. If there is no wall, the horde will burn Liraswet like Talaros. The children will die, not from stone, from iron." Lirina was silent. He continued, "I cannot argue with the priestesses. I am a stranger, a man, a short man. I have no voice in your council, but you do, and you know I'm right." Lirina looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "You speak like a man who isn't afraid of death." He shook his head. "I've already died. Once was enough. Now I'm afraid of something else." She asked, "What?" He said, "That the wall won't be ready in time." Liranil stood up, 5 meters tall in the dark hut. Her head almost touched the ceiling. She said, "The wall will be finished. The priestesses will be silent." I said. He bowed and left. Sarah was standing at the entrance. She had heard everything. She looked down at him. Her scar from ear to chin seemed deeper in the moonlight. She said quietly, "You are either brave or mad." He replied, "I am an engineer. That's the third option." Hajin invented block hoists to lift stone, speeding up the construction of the wall. Refugees from the burned village of Taliros brought news of the Crimson Horde's approach and a dead child in a sister's arms. The senior priestesses tried to stop the construction, calling it sacrilege, but Liranil ordered to continue. The wall was completed in 6 months, 3 meters high, 400 meters long, 1 meter at the base, tapering to half a meter at the top, 2 5-meter towers at the corners, a gate in the center reinforced with a double frame of ironwood. Hajin stood on the tower and looked east, at the endless forest stretching to the horizon. Somewhere out there, the horde was moving. Aerial scouts reported every week, 3 days' journey, 2 days' journey, 1 day. The horde was moving slowly. The battering rams were heavy. There was no road, but they were coming. Hajin used the time he had left. He built a 6-meter-high stone tower on a hill behind the village, an observation post. From it, one could see 2 kilometers toward the eastern clearing. He carved a sort of spyglass out of wood, not an optical one, just a long tube that helped focus his gaze on a distant point. Better than nothing. Ariel came to the wall every day. She examined it. She touched the stones. She checked their thickness. She tapped it with her fist. The wall didn't shake. She didn't pay him any compliments, but she stopped saying he was useless. For Ariel, that was progress. Hajin was preparing for a siege. He knew nothing of military affairs. He knew nothing of tactics. He knew nothing of how to command in battle. But he knew the engineering of sieges. He knew it from history. He knew it from the books he'd read in college when, instead of partying, he sat in the library. Roman fortifications, medieval castles, Korean fortresses from the Imjin War. He knew that a wall, in and of itself, was not a defense. A wall is time. Time for the defenders to strike from above while the enemy is stuck below. He built a walkway along the entire length of the wall on the inside, a wide one, wide enough for 3 giantesses to stand shoulder to shoulder. He stockpiled stones for throwing, piles of 200 stones every 20 meters along the wall. He built channels for boiling water in case the enemy got too close. He dug a moat in front of the wall, not very deep, 2 meters, but for ogres with heavy battering rams, even 2 meters is a delay. Ariel watched the preparations. Once she asked, "How do you know how to fight? You're a builder." Hajin replied, "I don't know how to fight. I know how to build so that fighting is easier." She frowned. She didn't understand the difference. He explained, "You and your warriors know how to fight. I know how to make it so that you fight standing on the wall, while they stand at the bottom of the moat. This isn't war, it's geometry." Ariel looked at him for a long time, then she nodded, for the first time, without irritation. The horde appeared at dawn on the 7th month. Hajin was standing on the tower and saw them first, a dark mass at the edge of the eastern clearing, moving, slow, large. He shouted down. Sarah ran to Ariel. The battle horn blared over the village, a low, drawn-out sound that made the leaves tremble. Women grabbed their weapons. Mothers led their children to the sacred tree. The female warriors lined up against the wall. 200 fighters, spears, bows, axes. Hajin stood on the tower and watched the approaching horde through his wooden spyglass. Ogres. He was seeing them for the first time. Massive, gray skin, 3.5 meters tall, twice as broad as the elves. In the hands of the front rows held battering rams, iron ones, 3 of them, each carried by 8 ogres. Behind the rams came the infantry, with swords and shields, iron ones. He counted about 400, against 200 elven women, 2 to 1, with iron weapons against wooden ones, with battering rams against a wall they hadn't seen yet, because they were marching toward a wooden palisade, which had stood here for 300 years, which was no longer there. In its place, a wall, stone on mortar, 3 meters high, a moat, a platform, piles of stones for throwing. Hajin descended from the tower. He approached Ariel. She stood at the gate in full battle gear, armor made of ironwood bark, a spear in her hand, a shield on her back, a 4-meter-20 warrior ready to kill. He told her, "Don't go beyond the wall. No matter what happens, don't go. Let them come to us. Let them climb the wall. We have the advantage from above. Stones, boiling water, arrows. They'd have to climb 3 meters under fire. That's death." Ariel looked at him, at the little man who came up to her waist, who was telling her, the future queen, how to fight. Her jaw clenched. Every muscle in her body wanted to go over the wall and fight face to face. That's how her mother and grandmother and great-grandmother fought, in the field, chest to chest, with a battle cry, not behind a wall like cowards. Hajin saw that struggle on her face. He said quietly, "Ariel, if you go outside the wall, they'll kill half your women. Iron against wood. You are stronger, but there are more of them, and they have swords that cut through your spears. Behind the wall, you'll lose 10. In the open field, you'll lose 100. She clenched her teeth. He added, "I didn't build this wall so cowards could hide behind it. I built it so your sisters could survive behind it." Ariel closed her eyes, opened them, nodded, briefly, sharply, like a sword strike, turned and bellowed the order, "To the wall! No one leaves the gate." 200 warriors climbed onto the platform. Hajin remained below, at the foot of the tower, with the wall's blueprints in his hands, because his place isn't on the wall. His place is here, where he can see everything and tell them where to send the reserves when the breach begins, if it begins. The battering ram struck the gate an hour later. A hollow thud reverberated across the entire wall. Hajin felt the vibration through his feet. A second blow, a third. The ironwood gate creaked but held. Stones flew from the wall onto the ogres' heads. Boiling water poured from the gutters. Screams, roars, the ogres' growls, the elves' battle cries. Hajin stood by the tower and counted. Blows, intervals, frequency. The gate would withstand 20 blows, maybe 25. The battering ram was iron. The gate frame was wooden, but thick, ironwood. He had built in a safety margin. It should be enough. The 12th blow, the gate cracked. The top beam of the frame split. Hajin shouted to Sarah, "Stones at the gate! From the inside. Throw them in." Sarah didn't ask why. 20 female warriors ran with piles of stones and began to block the gate from the inside. If the gate collapsed, there would be a stone barricade behind them. 18th blow. The gate burst open. The gate leaves swung apart and slammed into the wall of stones behind them. The ogres saw the stone barricade and stopped. They had been preparing for a breach in the wooden palisade. They weren't prepared for stone. While they stood in the opening, arrows and stones rained down from above. Ariel stood on the wall above the gate and hurled spears downward, one after another. Each found its mark. The assault lasted 4 hours. Then the horde retreated, slowly, fighting back, dragging away the wounded. Hajin counted 70 bodies on the ground in front of the wall. The elves' losses. 8 wounded, not a single one killed. Ariel climbed down from the wall. She approached Hajin. Her armor was covered in blood, someone else's. She looked down at him. Then she slowly dropped to one knee, to be at eye level with him. For the first time in 6 months, she said. The wall is holding, he replied. I know. She paused, then added, I listened to you. I didn't go beyond the wall. My sisters are alive. He nodded. She stood up. She walked over to the wounded. She didn't look back, but he saw her shoulders, always straight as a spear. For the first time in all the time he'd known her, they had relaxed a little. Hajin completed the construction of the fortress wall and prepared the defensive structures, including a moat, a platform, and a supply of projectile stones. The Crimson Horde attacked with 400 ogres and 3 iron battering rams. The wall withstood the assault, and the elves emerged victorious, suffering only 8 wounded compared to 70 ogres killed. For the first time, Ariel obeyed Hajin's order not to go beyond the wall. After the battle, everything changed. Not immediately, but like a crack in stone. First a thin line, then it widens. Then the world on either side is already different. The warriors who for 6 months had looked at Hajin as if he were an amusing little creature, now nodded to him when they met. Briefly, silently, but they nodded. Mothers who used to pull their children away when he passed by, now stopped and spoke. Hello, builder. The word builder sounded like Tarvan in Elvish, one who lifts stone. They began to call him Tarvan Hajin, or simply Tarvan. He didn't object. He liked it better than Shorty. A neighboring tribe sent an embassy a week after the battle. 5 giant women in ceremonial robes, tall, haughty, with gifts of hides and seashells. They had come to see the wall. Hajin was standing on the tower when they approached. He saw them stop in front of the wall and freeze. 3 meters of gray stone, smooth, solid, with towers at the corners. Nothing like it existed in their world. The envoys touched the stone with their hands. They tapped it. They tried to shake the block loose. They couldn't. One of them looked up and saw Hajin, a small, dark figure against the sky. She asked Sarah, who was standing below, something. Sarah answered. The envoy looked up again. Her face bore an expression that Hajin had already learned to recognize. Reassessment. When a creature you considered insignificant turns out to be the reason for a wall you cannot break. The envoys spent 3 days there. They walked around the village. They saw the mill, a water supply, drainage, wells with covers, a stone wall with a platform, and the man behind it all, small, dark-haired, with scraped hands and tired eyes. They left, and Hajin knew that the next delegation would arrive in a month, and the next one, and that their question would be the same. Can you build something like this for us? He was right. 3 weeks later, a delegation from the 2nd tribe arrived, and a month later, from the 3rd. The 3rd was the Terra Corvins tribe, women in black armor made of ironwood bark, stern, armed, not ambassadors, more like scouts. They looked at the wall with the eyes of people who understand war, and their gazes lingered on Hajin longer than he was comfortable with. But external affairs were the future. The present was here, in the village, in the growing city, because Lyraswet was no longer a village. Refugees kept coming, from Teleros, from the 2 other burned settlements, from distant clans who were simply afraid to remain alone. The population had grown from 6,000 to 9,000 in the 2 months following the battle. Hajin worked. New huts, expanding the water supply, a 2nd mill, a 3rd, a 4th. He taught Merva and 4 other women to lay stone on their own. They were his first female masons, rough around the edges, imprecise, but teachable. Merva now led her own crew of 10 women and built stone houses according to Hajin's blueprints. He inspected every building. He went from construction site to construction site. He measured. He made corrections. He cursed when the mortar was too runny. He praised when the corners were straight. Merva grumbled. But she got the job done, and her houses stood. Looney became his right-hand woman in matters concerning the forest, where to cut and where not to, which wood was suitable for rafters and which would rot within a season, which clay was suitable for bricks and which would crumble during firing. She knew the forest as well as Hajin knew structural mechanics. Together, they were more effective than apart. She came every evening. They sat by the fire and discussed the plan for the next day. Once, she asked him, Kim Hajin, are there people like me in your world? He didn't understand the question. What kind? People who talk to trees. He thought for a moment. No, he said, but there are those who listen to structures. They can sense when a beam is about to snap, when a wall has tilted by a millimeter. It's not magic, but it seems like it. Looney smiled, a small, quiet smile. She said, maybe we aren't so different after all. Then she paused. Then she added more quietly, in my world, priestesses and builders can be close, very close, if both want to. Hajin looked at her honey-colored hair in the firelight, at her big eyes, at the fingers clutching a piece of bark with a drainage plan she'd drawn herself. Drawn correctly, with a slope, with markings. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He said, "Looney, you now." She nodded. "I'm asking." He paused. Then he said, "In my world, they can too." She smiled wider, stood up, left, as always. But this time she turned around at the entrance. Hajin sat by the fire and realized that the world had just become more complicated. Not because of the horde, not because of the construction, because of the priestess with honey-colored hair who drew blueprints and asked questions to which he had no ready answers. Sarah stood in the shadows behind the hut. He didn't see her. She's seen everything, heard everything. Her face was stony. Her hand gripped the hilt of her sword. Not out of anger, out of something else. Something she couldn't yet name. After the victory over the horde, Hajin's authority grew, and he came to be called Tarvin. 3 neighboring tribes sent delegations upon seeing the stone wall. The population of Lyraswet grew to 9,000 thanks to the refugees. Looney openly expressed romantic interest in Hajin, while Seda watched from the shadows, experiencing feelings she hadn't yet come to terms with. The alliance of the 3 tribes was born not on the battlefield, but at a table, or rather, at a stone. A large, flat boulder at the foot of the sacred tree, upon which Hajin had spread out his largest drawing. A map. The first map of this world drawn to scale and with proper proportions. 3 tribes, 3 territories, rivers, roads that did not yet exist, but which he had already envisioned. Bridges he had already designed, aqueducts, walls. Liranil sat on one side of the stone, the matriarch of the second tribe, Veltis, on the other. Tara Corvin stood. She did not sit in the presence of strangers. 4 meters 80 in black armor made of ironwood bark, arms crossed over her chest, scars on her forearms, the face of a person who trusts only the sword. Hajin stood on the stone so he could be seen. He spoke in the trade dialect which he now spoke fluently. He pointed at the map. "Here is Lyraswet, the wall, the mills, the aqueduct. 9,000 inhabitants. The horde won't dare come here again. But the horde will go here." His finger moved to Veltis's territory. Or here, his finger on Tara's territory. "You have no walls, no mortar, no stone fortifications. The horde will crush you one by one, not because you're weak, because you're isolated." Veltis pressed her lips together. Tara didn't move. Hajin continued. "The road, right here, from Lyrasvet to Veltis, 30 kilometers, a stone embankment, smooth, wide. Reinforcements can be moved along it in a single day instead of 5. The second road from Lyrasvet to Tara, 40 kilometers, through the forest along a clearing. If one tribe is attacked, the other 2 can come to the rescue within a day. The horde won't be able to strike one at a time." They fell silent. Tara spoke first. Her voice was low, heavy. "You're building roads, walls, bridges. What do you want in return?" Hajin looked at her, from the bottom up. He was on a stone, she was in front of a stone, and yet she was still 2 meters taller. He said, "Workers, stone from your quarries, wood from your forests, and for your female masons to learn from mine. Not gold, not power, not an oath. Hands." Tara looked at him. Her eyes were black, impenetrable. Then she said, "My husband died 10 years ago. He was the last man of our line, a boy, skinny, weak, but brave. He went out against the ogre with a wooden spear, died in 3 heartbeats. Since then, I've decided that men in this world are either weak children or dead husbands." She paused. "You're neither one nor the other." Hajin didn't answer. He waited. Tara held out her hand, huge, scarred, a palm the size of his chest. He held out his. Her fingers closed around his wrist, gently, as if around a fledgling, a union. Veltis joined that same evening. The terms were the same: roads, walls, bridges, in exchange for labor and materials. Hajin stepped out from under the council canopy and saw the stars, alien, unfamiliar constellations he had never named in the past year. Seda stood beside him, silently, as always, he said without turning around. 3 tribes, 20,000 people. I need a road, a real one. She replied, I'm not a builder, I'm a soldier. He turned, looked at her, at the scar, at her shoulders, at the eyes in which something had been changing for a long time, but which he was afraid to name. He said, I need a soldier on this road. Someone has to guard the builders. The Horde will send scouts, saboteurs. She nodded. Then she said quietly, 5 years ago, my unit was retreating across a rope bridge, 12 of my girls. The bridge snapped. They fell, all of them. I stood on the bank and watched. Since then, I haven't commanded a squad. Since then, I've guarded one person at a time. You. Hajin was silent. She continued. That bridge, where it was, he knew. The ravine, that very one, 16 meters, where he predicted the collapse on the first day. He said, I will build a bridge there, a stone one that won't break, ever. Sarah was silent, for a long time. Then she said, if you build a bridge in that spot, I will guard your roads until the end. He nodded. He said, I'll call it the Bridge of the 12. Sarah turned away, quickly, but he managed to see it, the glint in her eyes, wet. She walked into the darkness. Hajin stood beneath foreign stars and thought about the bridge, about the arch, about the stones that support themselves, about the 12 names he doesn't know yet, but will learn. Hajin forged an alliance of 3 tribes by offering to build roads and walls in exchange for labor. Tira Corvins agreed to the alliance after a private conversation. Sarah told Hajin for the first time about the death of her squad on the rope bridge, and he promised to build the stone bridge of the 12 in that place. The bridge of the 12 took 40 days to build. Hajin designed it as his final project, as the most important one, because it was the most important, not in size, not in complexity, in significance. The ravine, 16 meters deep, 22 meters from edge to edge. Below, stones and the remains of the old rope bridge, overgrown with moss over the course of a year. Hajin stood at the edge and looked down. Somewhere down there among the rocks, 12 female warriors had fallen 5 years ago. He didn't know their faces, didn't know their names, but he knew one face, a scar from ear to chin, eyes that hadn't cried in 5 years. He unfolded the drawing, an arched bridge, a semicircular arch with a keystone at the top. The stones hold each other up. They press inward. The greater the load, the stronger the grip. Beautiful, eternal, like a law of physics expressed in stone. He designed the arch so that it mirrored the curve of the branches over the ravine. Elven aesthetics, harmony with the forest, not a straight line, a living curve. First, they erected wooden formwork, an arch-shaped frame on temporary supports. Merva and her crew chopped and hewn. Hajin demonstrated every curve, every degree of curvature. It took 3 days to set up the formwork. Then they began laying the stones, stone by stone, from the bottom up, on both sides simultaneously, toward the center, toward the top, where the keystone would rest, the most important stone, the one that turns a pile of blocks into an arch. Looney came every day. She sketched the process. She took notes. She already understood the principle. Each stone presses down on the one next to it. The weight is distributed along the curve down to the supports. The keystone at the top closes the curve and keeps everything from coming apart. She drew a diagram of the force distribution with arrows. Correct. Hajin looked at the drawing and said, You could be an engineer. She replied, I'm a priestess. He said, In my world, that doesn't get in the way. She smiled. On the 38th day, the 2 halves of the arch met at the top. There was room left for one stone, the keystone. Hajin carved it himself. Or rather, he instructed Merva on how to cut it. A wedge-shaped block, tapered toward the bottom, which would fit between the 2 upper stones and close the arch. Merva hewed it for half a day, smoothly, carefully, for the first time without grumbling. She understood. On the 39th day, everyone gathered in the morning. Sarah stood at the edge of the ravine, her face stony, arms at her sides, fists clenched. Standing nearby were the warriors from her old unit, those who had survived, those who hadn't been on that bridge. They knew what that bridge meant. Hajin climbed onto the formwork. The keystone was hoisted by the pulleys. He guided it. To the left. More. Stop. Down. The stones slid into the opening, tightly, with a soft sound like an exhalation. Hajin checked the fit. He tapped it. The stone sat perfectly. He climbed down. He looked at Sarah. He nodded. Take down the formwork. They began removing the supports, one by one. The wood creaked. The arch settled onto the stone, millimeter by millimeter. The formwork moved away from the arch and hung on the supports. The arch stood, on its own, without support, stone upon stone upon stone upon stone, 22 meters above a 16-meter chasm, supporting itself. Silence. Then Sarah took a step, onto the bridge, the first step. The stone didn't budge. The second. The third. She walked across the bridge slowly. Every step was heavy, not from the weight, from the memory. She reached the middle, stopped, placed her palm on the railing that Hajin had designed from stone posts with a wooden handrail. She stood on the stone bridge over the chasm where her girls had died, and the bridge held. It didn't creak, it didn't sway, it didn't break. It held. Sarah sank to her knees, right on the stone, in the middle of the bridge. She covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders, those very shoulders as wide as a doorway, shook. She was crying, for the first time in 5 years, silently, without words. She just cried. Hajin approached. He stood beside her. Her knee was at the level of his shoulder. He reached out and took her finger. Her palm didn't fit in his hand, but her finger did. She squeezed, gently, so as not to crush it. They stood there for a long time, a little man and a giantess on a stone bridge that could never break. A name was carved on every stone pillar of the railing. 12 posts, 12 names, the bridge of the 12. In the evening, Ariel came to the bridge, alone. She stood in the middle. She touched the arch. She touched the railing. She touched the stone beneath her feet. Then she spoke quietly into the void. She holds herself. No one heard, but Hajin stood at the far end of the bridge in the darkness and heard, and he thought that these were Ariel's first words in which there was neither anger, nor contempt, nor fear, only wonder. Pure, childlike wonder, like that of a child seeing for the first time that the world could be arranged differently. Hajin had built the arched bridge of the 12 across the ravine where Sarah's warriors had perished 5 years earlier. For the first time in the world's history, the arch supported itself without pillars or supports. For the first time in 5 years, Sarah wept as she stood on the bridge, while Hajin stood silently beside her, holding her finger. Ariel saw the bridge and for the first time showed genuine admiration. 1 year and 7 months after their arrival, the population of Liraswet had reached 60,000. The 3 tribes had merged into a single settlement that could no longer be called a village. It was a city, the first city in the history of Sylvanial. 3-story stone houses, paved streets, 4 mills, bamboo water pipes replaced by stone aqueducts, 2 brick factories. Hajin built brick kilns 4 months after the union, clay, molds, firing, unfired bricks for interior walls, fired bricks for exterior walls, faster than hewn stone, easier to lay. The school for female masons graduated its first 30 master builders, who constructed independently using blueprints. Merva commanded them. She became the city's chief foreman. Her grumbling now sounded not irritated but familiar, like the background noise of a construction site. Without it, it would be empty. The road to the Veltas territory was ready, 30 kilometers of stone embankment through the forest. Caravans carrying stone and timber traveled along it. 5,000 women from the second tribe came along it, wanting to live behind stone walls and drink clean water. The road to Terra was half finished. Sarah guarded the builders with a detachment of 40 female warriors, the first detachment she had commanded in 5 years. She didn't speak of it, but Hajin saw how she had changed. Her back straighter, her voice firmer, her eyes were livelier. She was a captain again, not an overseer of a stranger, but a commander on the road that was changing the world. Luni had officially become his right-hand woman. Liranil had appointed her as the builder's advisor on matters of the forest and spirits. It sounded ceremonial. In practice, it meant that Luni spent every day with him from dawn until midnight. She drew up blueprints, kept track of materials, translated his instructions into High Elvish for the crews from the new tribes. She understood his way of thinking. Sometimes she finished his sentences. Sometimes she offered solutions before he had a chance to think. Water reservoirs in case of drought. It was her idea, not his. He looked at the drawings she had made. 3 stone basins on a hill, filled during the rainy season, used during the dry season. A gravity-fed water pipeline down to the city. He said, "You just solved the drought problem for 60,000 people." She blushed. The tips turned pink. She said, "You taught me." He shook his head. "No, I taught you to see the slope. You found the solution yourself." That night she didn't come with questions. She came with an answer. She approached him by the fire, leaned down, and kissed him on the crown of his head, because the crown was at the level of her collarbone, and her lips reached just there. Hajin froze. She straightened up, smiled. He asked, "Does that count?" She replied, "In our world, a kiss on the crown of the head is like words you can't take back." She left. Hajin sat by the fire and touched the top of his head. Words you can't take back. He found Ilvu at the market. The market appeared 4 months after the union, spontaneous, in the square in front of the eastern gate. Women from 3 tribes sold fabrics and hides and dried meat and herbs, and among them stood a girl, small by elven standards, 3.5 meters, dark hair, dark eyes, not green like those of purebloods, brown, human. She was being sold. Hajin stopped. He looked. A rope around her neck, a sign on her chest. He could already read Elvish. Half-breed, corrupted. His fists clenched. He approached the vendor. He asked the price. The merchant laughed. She named a sum in shells that Hajin didn't have. He said, "I'll pay another way." He pulled a piece of bark from behind his belt. He drew an arch. He explained, "This arch is for your gate, the keystone. It will never collapse. My masons will build it, for free." The merchant stopped laughing. She looked at the drawing. She had seen the Bridge of the 12. Everyone had. She nodded. Ilva stood with a rope around her neck, looking at the little man who had just bought her for a drawing on a piece of bark. He walked over. He removed the rope, carefully. He threw it into the mud. He looked Ilva in the eyes. Brown. Wet. She said something, in a language he didn't know. Then she repeated it in the trade dialect. "Why?" he replied. "Because ropes around the neck aren't for people." She blinked. She said, "I'm not a person. I'm a half-breed." He replied, "You speak 5 languages. I speak 2.5. I think you're more useful than I am." The city had grown to 60,000 inhabitants, with brick factories, aqueducts, and cobblestone streets. Looney proposed a system of reservoirs to solve the drought problem and kissed Hajin on the top of his head. Hajin bought the half-breed Ilva out of slavery at the market, trading the blueprint for the arch for her freedom. The Crimson Horde returned at the end of the 2nd year, not as a reconnaissance unit, not 400 ogres like last time. An army, 1,200 fighters, 10 iron battering rams, 4 siege towers on wheels, clad in wet hides to protect against fire. Iron shields as tall as an ogre. Care Bloody Hand led them personally. 3.5 meters of gray, muscular flesh, a skull shaved completely bald, eyes like yellow coals in dark sockets. Around his neck, a necklace of elven blades taken from the slain. He was no mindless beast. He was a chieftain who read reports, who interrogated prisoners, who knew that the little man behind the walls was building a world in which there would be no place for ogres in 10 years. And he came while he could still win, while the walls were still young, while the roads were not yet all built, while the alliance was still fragile. Hajin learned of the army's approach 10 days ago. Ariel's scouts worked like clockwork, in shifts, all along the eastern border. A daily report, direction of movement, marching speed, size of the column, type of weaponry, number of battering rams and towers. Hajin stood over the map in the command room of the stone tower and thought. Not about the wall. He had already raised the wall to 4 meters and extended it along the entire eastern perimeter for 700 meters, with buttresses every 20 meters, with 3 towers, each 6 meters high, with a moat 3 meters deep and 4 meters wide, with a walkway along the entire wall on the inside, with a stockpile of stones for throwing, with chutes for boiling water. The wall would hold. He knew it. He'd calculated it 100 times. The wall would withstand 12 battering rams at once. If they struck a single point, it might not hold. But ogres don't strike a single point. They strike along its entire length. Distributed load. The wall will handle it. He was thinking about something else, about the road. The road to Terra had been completed 2 weeks ago. 40 kilometers of stone embankment through the forest, wide, smooth, 300 fully armed female warriors could be transported along it in a single day. Tara and her 300 fighters in black armor were a day's march away. The road to Veltis had been ready even earlier. Half a day's march, 200 fighters. He looked at the map. 3 arrows. The horde from the east, Tara from the south, Veltis from the north. A pincer movement. If the horde got bogged down at the wall and reinforcements arrived from the flanks via roads that Care didn't know and wasn't expecting. Hajin closed his eyes. He opened them. This wasn't military tactics. It was logistics, his specialty. Moving cargo from point A to point B in the shortest time possible. Only the cargo was alive, and the speed of movement determined how many of them would remain alive tomorrow. He sent messengers that very hour. The 2 fastest runners from Sarah's unit, one south to Tara, one north to Veltis. The order was simple. Set out immediately. Follow the road. Be at Lira Sveta by dawn on the 3rd day. Not before. Not later. Dawn of the 3rd day, because Hajin had calculated it. The horde would reach the wall on the 2nd day. Begin the assault on the morning of the 3rd. Get bogged down at the wall. And at that moment, the allies would strike from the flanks. Ariel stood at the table across from him, in full armor. Her spear leaned against the wall, gray eyes on the map. She listened to his plan in silence. Then she said, 1,200. We have 200 on the wall. Even with reinforcements, 700 against 1,200. He nodded. He said, 700 behind the wall against 1,200 in the open field. It's not 700 against 1,200. It's 700 with the advantage of height against 1,200 at the bottom of the trench. She frowned. He explained, every warrior on the wall is worth 3 in the open field. Height, cover, a supply of stones and boiling water. The enemy climbs up, she shoots down. It's not an equal fight, it's geometry. She was silent. Then she said quietly, you knew, when you were drawing the roads, you knew they'd come again. He replied, I built roads not just for trade. She looked at him, a small man, barely waist-high to her, who had planned this war a year before it began, not with a sword, not with magic, with stone and calculation. She said 2 words, my architect. For the first time, without mockery, without malice, without contempt, 2 words that sounded like an oath. Hajin heard them and remained silent, because his throat tightened. He turned away to the map and pretended to check the distances. 3 days until the assault. He used every hour. Reinforced the gates with an additional frame of ironwood. Stockpiled stones for a barricade behind the gates, in case the gates couldn't hold, like last time. Checked every joint in the wall, every buttress, every tower. Looney worked nearby. She now commanded a group of 12 priestesses who provided water and fire for the defense. The magic of wind and foliage couldn't kill, but it could fan the flames. It could direct a stream of boiling water. It could extinguish a fire if the enemy set the wooden parts of the wall ablaze. Hajin didn't understand how magic worked, but he understood that it worked, and he incorporated it into the defense plan like any other resource. Sarah was inspecting the garrison. 200 warriors on the wall, 40 in reserve, 20 in the towers with bows. She walked from post to post, quiet, focused. Her sword was sharpened to a mirror-like shine. Hajin saw her that evening. She was standing on the wall, looking east. He approached, stood beside her. His head came up to her waist. She said without turning around, last time you told me to guard the road. This time I'm standing here, on the wall, next to you. He didn't argue. He nodded. She added, if anyone climbs the tower where you're standing, I'll kill them before they get over the railing. That's not a promise, it's a fact. He believed her. The horde appeared at dawn on the 2nd day, just as he'd calculated. A dark mass on the eastern clearing, moving, slowly, heavily. The ground rumbled under 1,200 pairs of feet. Hajin stood on the central tower and looked through the spyglass that Looney had improved with a lens made of molten sand. Rough, cloudy, but it worked. He saw Care, at the head of the column, huge, with a 2-handed hammer on his shoulder. Yellow eyes stared at the wall. Hajin saw Care stop, how his face changed. Surprise. The wall had grown since the last time. It had been 3 meters, now it was 4. There had been 2 towers, now there were 3. There had been 1 moat, now it was deeper and wider. Then anger. Then cold calculation. Care turned to his commanders. He gave orders. The army began to form. 10 battering rams rolled forward. 4 siege towers rolled toward the wall. Hajin calculated the distance to the wall, the tower's speed, time until contact. 4 hours, maybe 5. The towers were heavy. The moat would slow them down. Care attacked at dawn on the 3rd day, just as Hajin had calculated. 10 battering rams at once, along the entire length of the wall. The clang of iron against stone echoed through the forest and scared the birds from the trees within a kilometer's radius. The siege towers rolled up to the wall. The ogres began filling the moat with fascines, bundles of brushwood and earth. They worked under fire. Stones rained down from the wall. Boiling water poured from the gutters. Arrows whistled. But the ogres didn't stop. Shields held overhead, iron ones. Arrows bounced off. Stones shattered the shields, but for every one broken, a new one was raised. Hajin stood on the central tower and gave orders, not an attack, a defense. His voice was quiet. Sarah stood beside him and repeated his orders at the top of her lungs. Reinforcements to the left flank, stones to the 3rd section, boiling water on the gate. Ariel was below, on the wall, in the front row, with a spear. She fought like a beast, every strike precise, every movement calculated. Hajin saw her pierce the ogre who had climbed over the parapet, how she knocked the second one back with a blow from her shield, how she shouted at her own to hold the line, and they held it, because she stood with them. The first 2 hours passed, the wall stood, casualties among the elves were minimal, 4 wounded, not a single one killed. The ogres lost more. Hajin counted 50 bodies in the moat and at the wall, but the battering rams kept pounding, monotonously, rhythmically. The stone trembled beneath their feet. The 3rd hour. The siege towers had closed in, 2 on the left, 2 on the right. The ogres began climbing the wall from the towers, heavy, in iron armor. Planks were thrown from the towers onto the parapet, hand-to-hand combat, wooden weapons against iron. Even with the advantage of height, it was terrifying. Hajin saw a giantess fall from the wall into the courtyard, with a severed shoulder, a scream, another, a fall, a 3rd. He gripped the tower's railing, his knuckles turned white. Sarah placed her hand on his shoulder, heavy, firm, hold on. The 4th hour. The ogres had breached the wall in 2 places. The left flank had retreated 10 paces. The right was holding, but barely. Ariel was fighting on the right flank. Hajin saw her get struck by a sword on her forearm. The armor held, but her arm was knocked back. She grabbed her spear with her other hand and kept fighting. Hajin looked east. The sun rose above the trees. Dawn of the 3rd day. Teira must be here, must be. If the road held, if the messenger made it, if she set out on time, if. Then he heard a horn, not an elven one, not an orc's, heavy, low-pitched, long drawn out, from the south. Teira. 300 female warriors in black armor made of ironwood bark emerged from the forest on the southern flank. Along the road, along the stone road that Hajin had spent 6 months building, which Sarah had guarded, along which 30 caravans carrying stone had passed, 40 kilometers in a single day, without stopping, at a run, because Teira doesn't walk, Teira runs. They struck the horde's flank, in formation, from a running start, a battle cry that rang in Hajin's ears even from the tower. Care turned around, his face. Hajin saw it through the telescope. Surprise, rage, and understanding. Instantaneous. Care was a smart leader. He understood immediately. The road. Where did the road come from? There was no road. There had been 5 days of forest trails, and now a stone embankment and 300 fresh fighters in the rear. A second horn. From the north, Veltus. 200 female warriors. Along the northern road, 30 kilometers in half a day. The horde found itself between the wall and 2 armies on the flanks. A pincer. An engineering pincer, not a tactical one. The wall held the front. The roads brought the flanks. Care could not retreat. The forest was behind him. He could not attack on 2 fronts. Not enough strength. He couldn't take the wall. It held. He didn't lose to an army. He lost to stone. Stone that lay under his enemy's feet 30 kilometers before this field. Stone that stood 4 meters high before him. Stone that a small man laid block by block, day after day, month after month, while Care sharpened his swords. The battle lasted another 3 hours after the reinforcements arrived, but the outcome was decided the moment the first horn sounded. Care fought to the end, personally, with a hammer. He killed 7 before he reached the wall. He climbed up himself, 3.5 meters of fury and iron. He scaled the parapet. Ariel was waiting. She hadn't come out over the wall. She had waited, just as Hajin had said the first time. Stay. Don't come out. Let them come to us. Care climbed over the edge of the wall and stood on the platform. Ariel stood before him, 4 meters 20 against 3.5. But he was heavier, in iron, with a hammer. She with a wooden spear. He struck. She stepped aside. The hammer slammed into the parapet and knocked out a stone block. Hajin on the tower flinched. His wall, his stone, his mortar. The knocked-out block flew down. Ariel struck. The spear entered the gap between his breastplate and helmet. Precisely. Deeply. Care froze. His yellow eyes went dark. He swayed and fell from the wall. Backward. Into the moat. The leader of the Crimson Horde lay in the moat dug by a small man and died from the spear of a woman who, for the first time in her life, had obeyed a man. The Horde fled, without a leader, without formation, into the forest. Teyra and Veltis gave chase. Hajin didn't watch. He climbed down from the tower. His legs wouldn't hold him. He sat on a step at the base. His hands were shaking. He hadn't fought. He stood on the tower. He counted. He commanded. But he saw every death, every fall, every scream. 4 slain elves, 23 wounded, against 300 slain ogres. 4, just 4. Last time, 0. Now, 4. Each of the 4 is a name he'll learn tonight, a face he'll remember. Ariel found him on the step, covered in blood, a stranger. Her armor was hacked to pieces. Her left gauntlet was split open, a scratch on her cheek from a stone shard, the very one Care had knocked from the parapet. She sat down beside him, huge, exhausted, alive. She was silent. Then she spoke. They followed your paths, Teyra and Veltis. They came for the stone you laid. He nodded. She placed her palm on his back, entirely, like that winter when children were dying of the plague. Her palm covered his back from shoulder blade to shoulder blade, warm, heavy, alive. She said quietly, "You won this war with a drawing, a year before the first strike." He closed his eyes, said, "No, your women won. I only built the road along which they arrived in time." She didn't remove her hand. He didn't ask her to. They sat on the steps of a ruined tower, a small man and a giantess warrior, and listened as the last cries of the fleeing horde faded beyond the wall. The war was over. Stone had defeated iron. The Crimson Horde had attacked Lyriswet with an army of 1,200 fighters, armed with battering rams and siege towers. The wall withstood a 4-hour assault. Reinforcements from Teyra and Veltis arrived via the stone roads and struck the flanks. Care's bloody hand fell to Ariel's spear on the wall. The horde was crushed. 4 elven women died. The war was won by engineering and stone. 2.5 years after arrival, the capital was called Elsinvar, which in High Elvish meant the place where stone sings. Looney came up with the name. Hajin thought that stone doesn't sing. Looney said he simply couldn't hear it. 900,000 inhabitants, 6 tribes, a network of roads totaling 400 kilometers in length, 11 stone bridges, 3 aqueducts, 7 mills, 2 brick factories, a school for female masons with 120 students, and one building that Hajin had been building for the past 4 months and that was meant to be the heart of it all, the council palace. Hajin stood on the scaffolding beneath the dome and looked up. The dome was his main project. Stone, self-supporting, 20 meters in diameter. Arches radiated from the central keystone like the ribs of an umbrella and rested on 12 columns in a circle. Between the arches were stone panels with slits for light. When the sun was at its zenith, light streamed inside in 12 rays and fell on the floor in a perfect columns in a circle. Hajin calculated the angles of the slits over 3 nights. He checked twice, redrew it 3 times, so that each ray would fall on its own slab. 12 stone slabs on the floor. Each bore a name, those very 12 names. The girls of Sarah. He hadn't forgotten. He had promised, and he hadn't forgotten. Merva stood nearby on the scaffolding, the Empire's chief foreman, 4 meters, broad palms in the chalk dust. She looked at the dome with an expression Hajin had never seen on her face before. "Awe," she said. 2 years ago, I thought you were a crazy little man with sticks, he replied. I am a crazy little man with sticks. Only now the sticks have gotten bigger, she snorted. But she smiled. Merva's first smile in 2 years that Hajin had seen. Under the dome stood a throne. Low, stone, made of white limestone polished to a matte sheen. Hajin had designed it so that whoever sat on it would be at eye level with her. Not higher, not lower, at eye level. Merva asked why it was so low. He answered, because the point isn't to look down from above. The point is to see. She didn't understand. He didn't explain. She'll understand when she sees it. He climbed down from the scaffolding, walked through the hall. The walls still smelled of fresh mortar, columns of white limestone, smooth, carved on each one, tree branches, leaves, flowers. Elven craftswomen carved the patterns from his sketches, which he drew at night by the light of an oil lamp. Another gift of his to this world. A lamp burning linseed oil in a glass shade made of fused sand, rough glass, slightly cloudy, but the light shining through it was even and warm. Such a lamp now burned in every house in Elsevar. Hajin drew the patterns on the columns with the memory of Korean pagodas in mind. Curved lines, natural forms, branches turning into arches, roots turning into foundations. The elves recognized their forest in these patterns and couldn't understand how a stranger from another world could see their world so accurately. He didn't explain. Beauty is beauty. It speaks the same language in any world. He stepped out onto the square. The square was paved with stone, smooth, well-fitted. A fountain stood in the center. Water rose through pipes powered by a water wheel behind the building and fell back into a stone basin. The first fountain in this world. Children played around it, splashing, laughing, squealing. Little giants as tall as him, healthy, rosy-cheeked. Not a single one had died from dirty water. Not a single one fell into a well. Not a single one lost her mother in battle because her mother stood behind a wall instead of in the field. He stood and watched them, and he remembered the girl from Talaros, the one who carried her dead sister in her arms for 2 days and wouldn't let go. He didn't know what had become of her. He needed to find out. He had to find her. He had to make sure she was alive and that she had a home and clean water and a lamp in the evening. A builder does not build walls. A builder builds life within the walls. Yova was walking across the square, 5 feet tall, dark hair pulled back in a braid, hazel eyes, human, scrolls in her hands, an inkwell at her belt. His chief secretary and translator. 2 years ago she stood in the market with a rope around her neck. Now she was walking across the square of the empire's capital, and every elf she passed bowed to her first. Because Ilva spoke on behalf of the guardian. She approached, bowed, an old habit he couldn't break her of. Spoken Korean, which she'd learned over 2 years. Not all of it, but enough. Hajin-nim, everything is ready. 6 queens in the reception chambers, the ceremony in an hour. He nodded. She hesitated, looked away, then at him. She said, Kim Hajin, do you remember what you told me at the market that day? He remembered. She continued, you said I'm more useful than you. You were wrong. But those were the first words in my life that made me want to wake up in the morning. I want you to know that, before you enter the hall. She turned and left, quickly, so he wouldn't see her face. He saw wet cheeks, wet brown eyes, the half-breed they called spoiled, who was now administering the oath to the queens. He stood there for a minute. Then he went to his room, a simple room in the east wing, not a palace chamber, a room. A table piled high with drawings, a bed, a chair, a blue robe draped over the back of the chair. He put it on, simple, made of local linen, blue because Looney had said that color suited him, and he hadn't argued with the priestess, who was always right on matters unrelated to engineering. He looked at the drawing on the table, a dome, the latest calculations. 1 arch bothered him, the third from the left. The keystone fit tightly, but he'd estimated the wind load during a winter storm, possibly a 2-millimeter shift, acceptable by all the standards he knew. But he didn't like it. He made a note in pencil. Check after the ceremony. Tighten if necessary. He hadn't it up until winter. Then he set the pencil aside. He stood up. He looked out the window. Elsenvar, his city, stone houses, cobblestone streets, an aqueduct on the horizon, bridges over ravines, mills by the river. And the forest, the endless relict forest all around. Trees 300 meters away, grass taller than his head. The world that had wanted to kill him 2 years ago. The world that was now his home. He went out and walked toward the hall. On the way, he met Sarah. She was standing at the entrance to the hall, in full battle armor, a sword at her belt, a scar running from her ear to her chin, 4.5 meters of quiet, unshakable strength. She looked at him. He looked at her. She said, "You look good." He said, "So do you." She almost smiled, almost. One corner of her mouth twitched. For Sarah, that was a broad smile. Then she said quietly, "The bridge stands." He replied just as quietly, "It will stand forever." She nodded. She took her position at the entrance, hand on her sword, back straight, eyes alive. The hall was filling up. Warriors in ceremonial armor stood along the walls. Priestesses in white robes stood by the columns. Looney was among them. Her honey-colored hair was pulled back into a high bun. In her hands was a scroll with the text of a blessing she had written herself. She stood by the third column, that very one, the third from the left, under the arch that had been troubling Haji. He looked at the arch, then at Looney, then back at the arch. The stone fit tightly, 2 millimeters, acceptable, but he would check it anyway. After the ceremony, townspeople filled the square outside. Thousands, tens of thousands. The whisper of voices drifted through the dome's windows like the sound of the surf. Hajin entered the hall. He walked between the columns. Light from the dome's slits fell in 12 beams onto 12 slabs bearing names. He walked past each name, read each one. The 12 girls of Seta, who fell from the rope bridge, who will never walk across the stone bridge, but whose names now lie in the light beneath the dome that holds itself up. He reached the throne, sat down, low, his eyes level with the waist of the standing elf, just as intended. 6 queens entered one by one. Lyranil first, 5 meters, white hair down to the ground, 312 years of wisdom and pain and loneliness, 300 years of a secret she carried alone. She carried a stone, gray, small, from her ancestral lands, near the root of the sacred tree Lyra Sveta. She placed it at the foot of the throne. Tata was second, 4 meters 80, black armor, a black stone from the banks of the Black River where the horde was defeated. She dropped to one knee, the first, without hesitation, without pause. A woman who for 10 years believed that men were either weak children or dead husbands. She bowed her knee before a man who had never once raised a sword. Veltis, the third, 2 stones from her quarry, white limestone from which this wall was built. Behind her, 3 matriarchs of distant tribes, who came without war, who saw the walls and roads and bridges and waterways and schools and lamps, and realized that resisting this was impossible. Not because it is power, because it is life. 6 stones at the foot of the throne, 6 queens in the hall. Ariel stood on the right, in ceremonial armor, cleaned of blood, with a spear, a new one. The old one had broken in Kyra's throat. Her face was calm, gray eyes, warm. She looked at Hajin and did not look away. My architect. 2 words she had spoken before the battle, which now meant more than a title, which meant everything. Sarah stood on the left, sword drawn, point down, at attention, a scar from ear to chin, a stony face, lively eyes. She had guarded him for 2 years, from enemies, from assassins, from himself when he forgot to sleep and eat. She stood by him when he cried on the steps after his first Mora, stood by him when he built a bridge for her dead girls. She stood by him when the earth shook from the battering rams. She would always stand by him. This is not a promise, it is a fact. Looney by the third column, the white robes of a priestess, honey-colored hair, a scroll in her hands. She looked at Hajin and smiled, quietly, as always. The priestess who was the first to ask why, not what, who drew the system of reservoirs, who kissed him on the crown of his head and said these were words that could not be taken back. Ilva stepped into the center of the hall, unrolled the scroll, and began to read the oath, in 5 languages. High Elvish, the trade tongue, the language of Tera, the language of Veltis, the language of the distant tribes, and the last, the 6th, Korean, for him alone, so that he might hear the words of the oath in the language of the world where he was born and died and was born again. The words were simple. We, the 6 clans of Sylvaniel, with free speech and solid stone, acknowledge the builder Kim Hajin as guardian of the lands and master of the stone. Not a king, not an emperor, guardian, master of the stone. Because he did not conquer this land with a sword, he raised it with stone. Lyranil approached last, slowly. each step like a metronome's beat, 300 years in every step. She stood before the throne, before the small man in the blue linen robe, who sat at her waist level and looked up at her, just like on the first day, when he lay in the mud in a hunting net. She raised her hand, placed her palm on his head, the same gesture, a finger the size of his forearm, but not like then, not a scientist's curiosity toward a specimen, a mother's palm, and the head of the son she had waited 300 years for. She spoke in the trade tongue, loudly, so the whole hall could hear, so the square outside the windows could hear, so that the forest beyond the walls could hear. A little man built an empire for us. Now a little man holds it. Silence. A silence that rang out. Then a sound, from outside, through the open slits in the dome, through 12 rays of light. A cry, thin, piercing, alive, demanding, angry at the whole world for being cold and bright and incomprehensible. The cry of a newborn. A baby was crying in the city, the first boy born in Elsinvar, healthy, large, loud, with lungs that worked like a blacksmith's bellows, alive. The elves in the hall froze. Everyone, 600 women in the hall and thousands in the square, they froze and listened to the baby's cry. A boy, a healthy boy, a sound that had not been heard in this world for generations. Lyrinil closed her eyes. Her hand on Hajin's head trembled. 2 tears rolled down her face, a face that had not known tears for 300 years. She knew why this child was born healthy. She knew the secret of the seed's silence. She knew that the curse was not a curse, that 300 years ago, the elves themselves had banished human blood from their veins and begun to die. She knew that the presence of a human near them, his breath, his sweat soaked into the stones he laid, his blood from his scraped hands left on the walls he built. All of this was the cure. Not magic, not a ritual, just life alongside a human, the very kind they had banished 300 years ago. She didn't tell him. She'll tell him later. Or he'll find out on his own. He's smart. He'll find the scroll in the library. Ilva will translate it. And then he'll come to her and ask why she kept silent. And she'll answer, "Because I was afraid you'd leave if you found out you're a cure and not a person." And he'll say, "Elder Mother, I would have stayed. I would have stayed anyway, because my bridges are here, my walls, my roads, my people." But that would be later. Right now she just stood there and cried, and her hand rested on the little man's head like a blessing she had waited 3 centuries for. Hajin sat on a low throne. He heard the baby's cry. He saw Lyrinil's tears. He saw Ariel to his right, her gray eyes, warm. For the first time in 2 years, there was no fear, no anger, no pain in them, only light. He saw Seru to his left, her hand on her sword, her scar, her lively eyes. The bridge stands, 12 names in the light. I saw Luni by the 3rd column, her smile, the scroll of blessing pressed to her chest, the priestess who learned to draw and taught him to hear the forest. I saw Ilva in the center of the hall, with the scroll of the oath, with wet brown eyes, a half-blood who thinks in 6 languages and stands above everyone in this hall, not in stature, in spirit. I saw Tara on one knee, black armor, the black stone by the throne, the queen who chose not a weak boy, nor a dead husband, but a living builder. I saw Merva in the hall's doorway, in work clothes, covered in lime dust. She hadn't changed. She came as she was, straight from the construction site, because the construction site is her dress uniform. I saw light streaming through the dome, 12 rays for 12 names. I saw the stone around me, my stone, every block of which had passed through my hands, or through the hands of those I'd taught. And I thought of one thing, the dome. The stone in the 3rd arch on the left sits tight, 2 millimeters of possible displacement, acceptable. But Hajin will check it anyway. After the ceremony, he'll climb the scaffolding, tap it, measure it, today. For now, he sits on a low throne beneath the dome that supports itself, and outside the windows, tens of thousands of voices are shouting. The townspeople have filled the square, thousands. The murmur of the crowd drifts through the slits in the dome like the sound of the surf. Hajin entered this hall an hour ago. He walked between the columns. Light from the slits fell in 12 beams onto 12 stone slabs bearing names. He walked past each one, read each one. 12 girls of Sarah, who fell from the rope bridge, who will never walk across the stone one. but whose names now glow in the light beneath the dome that will not collapse in 100 years or 500. He reached the throne, sat down, low, his eyes level with the waist of a standing elf. That was the plan. That was how he himself had ordered it built, so he could look up into their eyes, just as he had on the first day from the hunting net. 6 queens enter one by one. Lyranil first, 5 meters tall, white hair down to the ground, 312 years of wisdom and pain and loneliness. She carries a stone, gray, small, from her ancestral lands at the root of the sacred tree, Lyrasveta. She places it at the foot of the throne. Teta is second, 4 meters 80, black armor, a black stone from the banks of the Black River where the horde was defeated. She drops to one knee, first, without hesitation, without pause. A woman who for 10 years believed that men were either weak children or dead husbands. She bows her knee before a man who has never once raised a sword. Veltis is third, 2 stones from her quarry, the white limestone from which this wall is built. Behind her, 3 matriarchs of distant tribes. They came without war. They saw the walls and roads and bridges and waterways and schools and lamps, and they realized that resisting this was impossible. Not because it is power, because it is life. 6 stones at the foot of the throne, 6 queens in the hall. Ariel stands on the right, in ceremonial armor, cleaned of blood, with a spear, a new one. The old one broke in Kaeda's throat. Her face is calm, her gray eyes are warm. She looks at Hajin and does not look away. My architect. 2 words she spoke before the battle, which now mean more than a title, which mean everything. Sarah stands to his left, sword drawn, point down, guard stance, a scar from ear to chin, a stony face, lively eyes. She had guarded him for 2 years, from enemies, from assassins, from himself when he forgot to sleep and eat. She stood by him when he cried on the steps after the first Moor. She stood by him when he built a bridge for her dead girls. She stood by him when the earth shook from the battering rams. She will always stand by him. This is not a promise, it is a fact. Loony by the 3rd column, the white robes of a priestess, honey-colored hair, a scroll in her hands. She looks at Hajin and smiles, quietly, as always. The priestess who was the first to ask why, not what, who drew the system of reservoirs, who kissed him on the top of his head and said these were words that could not be taken back. Ilva steps into the center of the hall. She unrolls the scroll and begins to read the oath in 5 languages: High Elvish, the trade tongue, the language of Terra, the language of Veltis, the language of the distant tribes, and the last, the 6th, Korean, for him alone, so that he might hear the words of the oath in the language of the world where he was born and died and was born again. The words are simple. We, the 6 clans of Sylvanul, by our free word and firm stone, acknowledge the builder Kim Hajin as guardian of the lands and master of the stone. Not a king, not an emperor, guardian, master of the stone. Because he did not conquer this land with a sword, he raised it with stone. And here Hajin remembers. While Ilva reads, he closes his eyes for a single heartbeat and sees everything from the very beginning. He sees himself in the mud beneath Sarah's spear. He sees the first crooked post, which he straightened on the 2nd day using wedges and a lever made from a pole. He sees the faces of the giantesses when the hut stopped leaning. They didn't believe him. They decided the stranger was a sorcerer, but he just knew where to apply pressure. He sees the first well, which he covered with a lid and surrounded with a wall, and not a single child ever fell headfirst into it again. He sees the first stone bridge in place of the rotten rope one, that very one, for Sarah's girls. He built it and wept, and Sarah stood silently beside him, holding a torch all night. He sees the first plague when children were dying from dirty water, and he sketched a system of reservoirs with eyes burning from sleeplessness, while Looney translated his drawings into words the craftswomen could understand. He sees the horde's first battering ram shattering against the wall he had calculated to have margin of safety. He sees the hundreds of days between these flashes, thousands of stones, palms scraped raw, that blood remained on the walls. He didn't know then what it meant. He opens his eyes. Ilva finishes reading the oath. Her voice trembles on the last words, but does not break. Lyranil approaches last, slowly, each step like a metronome's beat, 300 years in every step. She stands before the throne, before the small man in a blue linen robe who sits at her waist level and looks up at her from below. Just like on the first day, when he lay in the mud in a hunting net. She raises her hand, places her palm on his head, the same gesture, a finger the size of his forearm, but not like then, not a scientist's curiosity toward a specimen, a mother's palm on the head of the son she has waited 300 years for. She speaks in the trade dialect, loudly, so the whole hall can hear, so the square outside the windows can hear, so the forest beyond the walls can hear. A little man built an empire for us. Now the little man holds her. Silence, a silence that rings out. Then a sound, from outside, through the open slits in the dome, through 12 rays of light. A cry, high-pitched, piercing, alive, demanding, angry at the whole world for being cold and bright and incomprehensible. The cry of a newborn. A baby is crying in the city. The first boy born in Elsinore, healthy, large, loud, with lungs that work like a blacksmith's bellows. Alive. The elves in the hall freeze, all of them, 600 women in the hall and thousands in the square. They freeze and listen to the baby's cry. A boy, a healthy boy, a sound that hasn't been heard in this world for generations. Lyrino closes her eyes. Her hand on Hajin's head trembles. 2 tears roll down a face that has not known tears for 300 years. She knows why this child was born healthy. She knows the secret of the silence of the seed. She knows that the curse was not a curse, that 300 years ago the elves themselves banished human blood from their veins and began to die. She knows that the presence of a human among them, his breath, his sweat soaked into the stones he laid, his blood from his scraped hands left on the walls he built, all of this was the cure. Not magic, not a ritual, just life alongside a human, the very kind they had banished 3 centuries ago. She didn't tell him. She'll tell him later, or he'll find out on his own. He's smart. He'll find the scroll in the library. Ilva will translate it. And then he'll come to her and ask why she kept silent. And she'll answer. Because I was afraid you'd leave if you found out that you're medicine, not a human.
And he'll say,
Elder Mother, I would have stayed. I would have stayed anyway, because here are my bridges, my walls, my roads, my people. But that will be later. Right now, she just stands there and cries, and her hand rests on the little person's head, like the blessing she has been waiting for 3 centuries. Hajin sits on a low throne. She hears the baby's cry. She sees Lyrinel's tears. She sees Ariel to her right, her gray eyes, warm. For the first time in 2 years, there is no fear, no anger, no pain in them, only light. She sees Sarah to her left, her hand on her sword, her scar, her lively eyes. The bridge stands, 12 names in the light. He sees Looney by the 3rd column, her smile, the scroll of blessing pressed to her chest, the priestess who learned to draw and taught him to hear the forest. He sees Ilva in the center of the hall, with the scroll of the oath, with wet brown eyes, a half-blood who thinks in 6 languages and stands above everyone in this hall, not in height, in spirit. He sees Tara on one knee, black armor, a black stone by the throne, the queen who chose not a weak boy, nor a dead husband, but a living builder. He sees Merva in the hall's doorway, in her work clothes, covered in lime dust. She didn't change. She came as she was, straight from the construction site, because the construction site is her dress uniform. He sees light streaming through the dome, 12 rays for 12 names. He sees stone all around him, his stone, every block of which has passed through his hands, or through the hands of those he has taught. And he thinks of one thing, the dome, the 3rd arch on the left, the keystone, 2 millimeters of possible displacement during a winter storm. Check it, today, after the ceremony. Climb the scaffolding, tap it, measure it. If it needs tightening, tighten it. If not, mark it for the next inspection in a month. Because the dome must stand for 100 years, 200, 500. It must stand when Hajina is no longer here, when Merva's students teach their own students, when Looney's daughters read her blueprints and draw their own, when Ariel's children grow up beyond the walls he built for them, when the names of Sarah's 12 girls are read in the light of the dome by people who don't know who Sarah is, but know that the bridge stands. He was a builder. He will remain a builder, always. Somewhere out there beyond the window, a midwife is washing the first boy of this world. In 20 years, this boy will take a plumb line and a measuring tape in his hands and stand on the scaffolding next to Hajin's apprentices. In 50 years, his sons will build a road to the sea. Hajin will not see this, but he knows it will happen, because he did not lay a stone, he laid the foundation. An empire is not a throne. An empire is a dome that supports itself, and someone must check every stone, every joint, every degree of slope, every day, every year, as long as the walls stand. Light pours through the dome. A baby cries outside the window. 6 queens stand before a small man in a blue robe who looks at them eye to eye and sees each one, not as interchangeable daughters of the forest, each one, individually, by name, by pain, by dream. And for the first time in 300 years, no one dies in Sylvanul. Hajin rises from the throne. Everyone is waiting for a speech. He does not give a speech. He turns to Merva in the doorway and utters a single word in their language, the first one he ever learned, forests. She nods. She understands immediately, and while the 6 queens and 600 warriors and thousands of townspeople watch him go, the guardian of the lands and master of the stone goes to check the 3rd arch, because the ceremony is over and the dome must stand. The 3rd arch on the left, the keystone, 2 millimeters of possible displacement during a winter storm. Check it, today, after the ceremony. Climb the scaffolding, tap it, measure it, if it needs tightening. If not, mark it for the next check in a month, because the dome must stand for 100 years, 200, 500. It must stand when Hajina is no longer here, when Merva's students teach their own students, when Looney's daughters read her blueprints and draw their own, when Ariel's children grow up beyond the walls he built for them, when the names of Sarah's 12 girls are read in the light of the dome by people who don't know who Sarah is, but know that the bridge stands. He was a builder. He will remain a builder, always, because an empire is not a wall. An empire is a dome that supports itself, and someone has to check every stone, every seam, every degree of slope, every day, every year, as long as the walls stand. Light poured through the dome. A baby cried outside the window. 6 queens stood before a small man in a blue robe who looked at them eye to eye and saw each one, not as interchangeable daughters of the forest, each one, individually, by name, by pain, by dream. And for the first time in 300 years, no one died in Sylvanul.